In 1887, four orphaned sisters are dragged onto an auction block by their own uncle and sold like livestock. 15-year-old Clara stands in front of a hungry crowd, determined to keep her younger siblings together, even if it costs her everything. As bids are shouted and greedy eyes circle closer, a stranger steps forward, cold, dangerous, unreadable. Caleb Ward offers a price no one dares to challenge. But is this salvation or just another form of captivity? Follow this story to the end. Hit like and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this journey reaches. The auction block smelled like livestock and desperation. Clara Brennan stood at the front of the platform, her spine rigid despite the trembling in her knees, and forced herself to look straight ahead into the crowd of men gathered in the dirt courtyard. Behind her, pressed close enough that she could feel their shallow breathing, stood her three younger sisters, May, Ruth, and Lila. The youngest still clutched a rag doll with one button eye missing. Their uncle Vernon stood off to the side, arms crossed, chewing tobacco with the casual indifference of a man selling off a lame horse. He hadn't looked at them once since dragging them here at dawn. "Lot 17?" the auctioneer called out, his voice crackling across the dry Kansas wind. Four girls, healthy, able-bodied, youngest is 6, oldest 15, clean stock, no disease. Clara's jaw tightened. Stock. Like cattle, like furniture. She felt May's hand slip into hers, clammy and shaking, and squeezed back hard enough to hurt. She needed her sister to stay quiet. Needed all of them to stay quiet. One wrong word and Vernon would make it worse. He always did. The crowd shifted, boots scuffing dust. A few men leaned in, squinting at them like they were evaluating plow horses. One scratched his beard and muttered something to the man beside him. Another spat into the dirt and turned away. "Start the bidding at $10, the auctioneer said. $10 for all four of them. Clara's stomach twisted. She'd known it would be bad, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that hollowed her out from the inside. $10. Less than what their father's plow had sold for after he died. Less than the cost of a decent saddle. 12, someone called from the back. 15. 18. The bids came slow, grudging. Clara scanned the crowd, trying to make sense of the faces. A ranch hand with a scar across his cheek. A heavy-set man in a stained vest who looked like he ran a saloon. A farmer whose eyes lingered too long on May. Every single one of them made her skin crawl. Behind her, Ruth whimpered. Clara reached back without turning and gripped her sister's wrist. "Don't cry, don't give them a reason to split us up." $22, the scarred man said. 25, Swan, the farmer countered. The auctioneer nodded, his gavel poised. 25 going once. 30, a new voice cut in, low, flat, carrying the kind of weight that didn't need volume. The crowd turned. Clara turned too, craning her neck to see past the rows of hats and shoulders. At the edge of the courtyard stood a man she hadn't noticed before. Tall, broad through the chest and shoulders, wearing a dusty coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed most of his face. He didn't step forward. Didn't move at all, really. Just stood there with his hands loose at his sides and his gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance, like he'd already decided something and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. The auctioneer blinked. $30 for the lot? All four, the man said. His voice didn't rise, didn't need to. Together. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The farmer frowned and glanced at his neighbor. The scarred man shook his head and stepped back. 35, someone tried half-heartedly. 50, the tall man said. The courtyard went quiet. Clara stared at him, her pulse hammering in her throat. $50. That was more than twice what anyone else had offered, more than enough to make Vernon grin like a weasel. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. The auctioneer cleared his throat. $50. Going once? Going twice? No one else spoke. The tall man didn't move. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold. Vernon ambled over to collect his money, whistling under his breath. Clara watched him shake the stranger's hand like they were old friends, watched him pocket the bills without so much as a glance back at the four girls he'd just sold off. When he finally did turn, it was only to spit into the dirt near Clara's feet. "Pleasure doing business," Vernon said, tipping his hat to the stranger. Then he walked away, boots kicking up dust, and didn't look back. Clara's hands curled into fists. She wanted to scream at him, wanted to chase him down and claw his eyes out, but she stayed where she was, because anything else would have scared her sisters worse than they already were. The tall man approached the platform. Up close, Clara could see more of him: weathered skin, a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of granite, eyes the color of winter sky. He stopped a few feet away and studied them in silence, not leering, not sizing them up like the others had, just looking, like he was deciding something. "You're Clara," he said finally. She blinked. "How do you—" "Your father was James Brennan, worked a homestead 10 miles east of here before the fever took him and your mother." He tilted his head slightly. "That about right?" Clara's throat went dry. "You knew him?" "Knew of him. Heard he had 4 daughters." His gaze shifted to May, Ruth, and Lila, then back to Clara. "Heard your uncle was a bastard." She didn't know what to say to that. It was true, but hearing a stranger say it out loud felt strange, dangerous even. "My name's Caleb Ward," the man continued. "I run a ranch about 20 miles north. You'll be coming with me." It wasn't a question. Clara bristled. "And if we don't want to?" Caleb's expression didn't change. "Then you can walk back to wherever your uncle was keeping you and see how long it takes before he sells you off again, or worse." He gestured toward the dispersing crowd. "Some of these men would have bought you one at a time, split you up. You understand what that means?" Clara's stomach clenched. She understood. She'd been trying not to think about it all morning. "I bought all 4 of you because I'm not interested in separating families," Caleb said. "But I'm not running a charity. You'll work. You'll earn your keep, and you'll follow my rules. That clear?" Clara wanted to argue. Wanted to tell him they didn't need his help, that they could take care of themselves. But the words stuck in her throat because they both knew it was a lie. Without money, without land, without anywhere to go, they were as good as dead. Or worse. "It's clear," she said quietly. Caleb nodded once. "Good. Get your things." "We don't have things," May said, her voice small and hoarse. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, then turned and walked toward a wagon hitched at the edge of the courtyard. "Then get in the wagon." The ride north was silent except for the creak of the wheels and the rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves. Clara sat in the back with her sisters, one arm around Lila, the other braced against the wooden side of the wagon to keep from bouncing too hard on the uneven trail. The prairie stretched out in every direction, flat and endless, broken only by the occasional scrub brush or windmill. Caleb drove without speaking. He didn't look back at them, didn't ask questions or try to make conversation, just kept his eyes on the horizon and his hands steady on the reins. Ruth leaned close to Clara and whispered, "Do you think he's going to hurt us?" "I don't know," Clara whispered back. Honesty felt safer than false comfort. "He doesn't look mean," May offered quietly. "Doesn't look nice either," Ruth muttered. Clara didn't respond. She watched the back of Caleb's head, trying to figure him out. He hadn't smiled once, hadn't raised his voice or made threats. He'd paid $50 for them without hesitation, and that alone made her uneasy. People didn't do things like that for no reason. Lila tugged on Clara's sleeve. "I'm thirsty." "We'll get water when we stop," Clara said, though she had no idea when that would be. Lila's lower lip trembled, but she nodded and tucked herself closer to Clara's side. The rag doll dangled from her other hand, its one-button eye staring blankly at the sky. They rode for what felt like hours. The sun climbed higher, baking the prairie until the air shimmered. Clara's mouth was dry as sand, her legs stiff and aching from the hard wagon bed. She was about to ask Caleb if they could stop when he finally pulled the horses to a halt near a shallow creek lined with cottonwood trees. "Stretch your legs," Caleb said, climbing down from the driver's seat. "Water the horses. Drink if you need to." The sisters scrambled out of the wagon, May and Ruth rushing toward the creek while Lila clung to Clara's hand. Clara led her down to the water's edge and crouched, cupping her hands to drink. The water was cool and tasted faintly of minerals, but it was the best thing she'd felt all day. Lila drank too, dipping her whole face in and coming up sputtering. Clara almost smiled. Almost. Caleb stood near the horses, checking their hooves and adjusting the harnesses. He moved efficiently, methodically, like a man who didn't waste time or motion. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye, still trying to decide whether he was their salvation or just another kind of trap. "You always this quiet?" she called out before she could stop herself. Caleb glanced over his shoulder. "You always this mouthy?" Clara's cheeks flushed. "Just wondering what you're planning to do with us." "Told you already. You'll work. You'll learn. You'll stay out of trouble." He finished with his harness and straightened. "Past that, it's up to you." "Up to us," Clara repeated flatly. "That's what I said. And what happens if we don't work hard enough, or if we break one of your rules?" Caleb's eyes met hers across the space between them, steady and unreadable. "Then we'll deal with it when it happens. I'm not in the habit of explaining myself twice." It wasn't the answer Clara wanted, but it was the only one she was going to get. She turned back to her sisters, helping Lila dry her face with the hem of her dress, while May and Ruth splashed water at each other like nothing had changed, like they hadn't just been sold off an auction block an hour ago. 5 minutes, Caleb said. Then we move. The ranch appeared just as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the dusty yard. It wasn't much. A single-story house with a sagging porch, a barn that looked like it had survived a few too many storms, a chicken coop, and a corral with a handful of horses. Everything was functional, but worn, built for survival rather than comfort. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop near the house and climbed down. "Inside, Joe," he said, nodding toward the door. The sisters exchanged glances, then followed him across the yard. The porch boards creaked under their weight. The door opened into a main room that was dim and sparse. Wooden furniture, a stone fireplace, a table with 4 mismatched chairs. It smelled like wood smoke and leather, and something Clara couldn't quite place. Loneliness, maybe. Caleb crossed to the fireplace and crouched to start building a fire. "There's a back room with 2 beds," he said without turning. "You'll share. Blankets are in the trunk. I'll bring in water for washing." "Where do you sleep?" Ruth asked, her voice tentative. "Loft." Caleb struck a match and held it to the kindling. Flames caught and began to spread. "Out of your way." Clara frowned. "You live here alone?" "Did." "What changed?" Caleb stood, brushing his hands off on his trousers. He looked at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You did," he said simply. Then he walked past them and out the door, letting it swing shut behind him. The sisters stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do with themselves. May drifted toward the table and ran her hand along the scarred wood. Ruth peeked into the back room. Lila stayed glued to Clara's side, her doll clutched tight. "I don't like it here," Lila whispered. Clara knelt down and smoothed her sister's tangled hair. "I know, but it's better than where we were." "Is it?" Clara didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. Caleb returned a few minutes later carrying a bucket of water and a bundle of cloth. He set them down near the fireplace and gestured toward the back room. "Clean up. There's soap in the wash basin. Clothes in the trunk might fit well enough until I can get you proper ones." "You're giving us clothes?" May asked, surprised. "Can't have you walking around in rags," Caleb said. "Makes the place look bad." It was such a blunt, practical answer that Clara didn't know whether to be grateful or insulted. She settled for nodding and herding her sisters toward the back room. The space was small but clean, with 2 narrow beds and a wooden trunk pushed against the wall. Clara opened the trunk and found a stack of folded shirts, trousers, and dresses, plain, sturdy, clearly meant for work. She pulled out a few pieces and handed them to May and Ruth. "Change," she said. "Wash first if you can." May wrinkled her nose. "These smell like a barn." "They smell like clean fabric," Clara corrected, "which is more than we've had in weeks." They washed quickly, scrubbing dirt and sweat from their faces and arms, then dressed in the borrowed clothes. Everything was too big, but it was better than the threadbare dresses they'd been wearing. Clara helped Lila into a shirt that hung past her knees, then rolled up the sleeves and tied a belt around her waist to keep it from dragging on the floor. When they emerged, Caleb was at the table ladling stew from a pot into 4 chipped bowls. The smell hit Clara like a punch to the gut. Meat, potatoes, carrots, something rich and savory that made her mouth water. She couldn't remember the last time they'd eaten anything that wasn't scraps or moldy bread. "Sit," Caleb said, not looking up. They sat. Clara watched him warily as he set a bowl in front of each of them, then took the last for himself and leaned against the wall, eating standing up. May picked up her spoon and hesitated. "Is this for us?" "You see anyone else here?" Caleb said. Ruth didn't wait for further permission. She dug in, shoveling stew into her mouth like she was afraid it would disappear. May followed suit. Lila ate slowly, cautiously, glancing at Clara between bites as if checking for approval. Clara forced herself to eat at a normal pace, even though her stomach was screaming. The stew was good, simple, but hot and filling. Real food. She hadn't realized how much she'd missed it. "Thank you," she said quietly. Caleb grunted. "Don't thank me. You'll work it off starting tomorrow." "Doing what?" "Whatever needs doing. Feeding chickens, mucking stalls, hauling water, mending fence." He scraped the last of his stew from the bowl and set it aside. "You'll figure it out quick enough." "And if we don't?" Caleb's gaze flicked to her, sharp and measuring. "Then you'll learn. I don't tolerate laziness, but I don't expect perfection either. You put in the effort, you'll be fine." Clara held his stare, trying to read him, trying to figure out if he was telling the truth or just saying what she wanted to hear. But his face gave nothing away. It was like looking at stone. "We'll work," she said finally. "Good." Caleb pushed off the wall and headed for the door. "Get some sleep. Sun's up at 5, and so are you." He left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. "Banamasam." That night, Clara lay awake in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams barely visible in the darkness. Beside her, May was already asleep, breathing deep and even. Across the room, Ruth and Lila shared the other bed, tangled together like puppies. Clara's mind wouldn't stop turning. She kept replaying the auction, the ride, the stew, Caleb's flat, unreadable voice. "You'll work. You'll learn. You'll stay out of trouble." It sounded simple. Too simple. Nothing in Clara's life had ever been simple. She thought about her father, who'd worked himself into the ground trying to keep the homestead running. She thought about her mother, who died quietly in the night after weeks of fever, holding Clara's hand until the very end. She thought about Vernon, who'd shown up the day after the funeral with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and promises he never intended to keep. And now she thought about Caleb Ward, who'd paid $50 for 4 orphaned girls and brought them to a ranch in the middle of nowhere, who fed them and clothed them and asked for nothing except work. Clara didn't trust it, couldn't trust it. Men like Caleb didn't exist, not in her experience. Everyone wanted something, everyone had an angle. She just had to figure out what his was before it was too late. Morning came too soon. Clara woke to the sound of boots on the porch and pale gray light filtering through the window. She sat up, disoriented for a moment, then remembered where she was. The ranch. Caleb's ranch. The door opened and Caleb stepped inside, already dressed and moving like he'd been awake for hours. He glanced at the back room, saw Clara stirring, and nodded once. "Up, he said. "All of you." Clara shook May awake, then crossed to the other bed to rouse Ruth and Lila. They groaned and protested, but they got up, rubbing sleep from their eyes and stumbling into the main room. Caleb had breakfast waiting, cornmeal mush, fried eggs, and thick slices of bread. It wasn't fancy, but it was hot, and there was enough for everyone. The sisters ate quickly, quietly, still not sure how to behave around him. When they finished, Caleb pointed at Clara. "You're with me. Barn work." He pointed at May and Ruth. "You two, chicken coop. Feed them, collect eggs, clean out the nests." Then he looked at Lila, who shrank back behind Clara's leg. "You stay with your sister. Watch and learn." Clara felt a flicker of relief. At least he wasn't planning to separate them. Not yet, anyway. They followed Caleb outside into the cool morning air. The sky was still pale, the sun just beginning to crest the horizon. The ranch looked different in daylight, less foreboding maybe, but no less harsh. Everything about it was hard edges and stubborn endurance. Caleb led Clara and Lila to the barn, which smelled like hay and horses and manure. He handed Clara a pitchfork and gestured toward the stalls. "Muck these out. Pile the dirty straw outside. Fresh hay's in the corner." Clara took the pitchfork and stared at the stalls. She'd never mucked a stall in her life. Her father had farmed crops, not livestock. Caleb must have seen the hesitation on her face because he stepped closer and took the pitchfork back. "Like this," he said, demonstrating with quick, efficient motions. "Dig under, lift, toss. Don't try to do it all at once. Small loads, steady pace." He handed the pitchfork back to Clara. "Your turn." She tried to mimic his movements, but the first forkful was too heavy and she nearly dropped it. The second was better. The third, better still. Caleb watched without comment, then nodded and moved on to check the horses. Lila sat on an overturned bucket near the door, clutching her doll and watching Clara work. "Are we going to live here forever?" she asked softly. "I don't know," Clara said, heaving another forkful of soiled straw out of the stall. Her arms were already burning. "I miss Mama." Clara's chest tightened. "Me too, Lila." "Do you think she'd be mad at us?" "For what?" "For letting Uncle Vernon sell us." Clara stopped and turned to look at her youngest sister. Lila's face was pale and pinched, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked so small, so breakable. "Mama wouldn't be mad," Clara said firmly. "We didn't have a choice, and we're still together. That's what matters." Lila nodded, but she didn't look convinced. Clara went back to work, stabbing the pitchfork into the straw harder than necessary. She was angry, at Vernon, at the world, at herself for not being able to protect her sisters the way she should have. But anger didn't clean stalls or put food on the table, so she swallowed it down and kept moving. By the time she finished the third stall, her hands were blistered and her shoulders ached. She was sweating despite the cool air, her borrowed shirt clinging to her back. But the stalls were clean, and the fresh hay smelled better than the old. Caleb returned and inspected her work without a word. Then he nodded. "Good enough. Now feed the horses." He showed her how much grain to measure, how to distribute it evenly, how to check the water troughs. Clara listened carefully, committing every step to memory. She didn't want to give him a reason to regret bringing them here, not when it was the only thing standing between them and the auction block. The days that followed blurred together into a rhythm of work and exhaustion. Clara mucked stalls, hauled water, mended fences, and learned how to handle a horse without getting trampled. May and Ruth tended the chickens, collected eggs, and helped with the cooking. Lila followed Clara everywhere, slowly learning to carry buckets and sweep floors. Caleb didn't coddle them. He gave orders and expected them to be followed. If they made mistakes, he corrected them once and moved on. If they succeeded, he said nothing. It was a strange kind of fairness, harsh but consistent. Clara found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, trying to piece together who he was. He worked harder than any of them, up before dawn and out after dark, fixing things that broke and tending to problems she didn't even know existed. He never complained, never raised his voice, never touched them except to show them how to do something the right way. It was unsettling. Clara had braced herself for cruelty, for violence, for the kind of treatment she'd expected from a man who bought children at auction. But Caleb was none of those things. He was just there, steady, immovable, and that somehow scared her more than anything. 2 weeks in, Clara woke in the middle of the night to the sound of voices outside. She sat up, heart pounding, and crept to the window. Through the gap in the curtains, she could see Caleb standing in the yard, talking to a man on horseback. The stranger's voice was low and urgent, but Clara couldn't make out the words. Caleb's posture was tense, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. He said something sharp, and the stranger shook his head and rode off into the darkness. Clara stayed at the window until Caleb turned and walked back toward the house. She dove back into bed, pulling the blanket up to her chin and squeezing her eyes shut. The door opened. Footsteps crossed the floor. Then silence. Clara lay there, heart hammering, and wondered what kind of man Caleb Ward really was, and whether she'd just traded one nightmare for another. Clara didn't mention the midnight visitor to anyone, not to her sisters, and certainly not to Caleb. She filed it away in the growing list of things she didn't understand about him. right alongside his silence and the way he never seemed to sleep more than a few hours at a time. 3 days later, the same man returned. Clara was hauling water from the well when she spotted him riding up the trail, dust rising behind his horse. He was older than Caleb, maybe 50, with a gray beard and a star pinned to his vest. A lawman. Caleb emerged from the barn before the man even dismounted, wiping his hands on a rag. His expression was flat, unreadable as always. "Sheriff," he said. "Ward." The lawman swung down from his horse and tied the reins to the porch rail. "Got a minute?" "Depends what you want." The sheriff's gaze drifted past Caleb to where Clara stood near the well, then over to May and Ruth, who were hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Heard you bought some girls off Vernon Brennan," the sheriff said. "Heard right." "That's so." The sheriff hooked his thumbs into his belt. "Mind telling me why?" Caleb's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed level. "Didn't realize I needed your permission to conduct business." "You don't. But when a man shows up at an auction and drops $50 on 4 orphans, people talk. And when people talk, I have to listen." The sheriff shifted his weight. "So I'm asking, what's your interest in those girls?" Stomach clenched. She set the bucket down slowly, trying not to draw attention to herself. But she couldn't stop watching, couldn't stop listening. Caleb stepped closer to the sheriff, his posture changing in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. "You know me, Garrett. You know what kind of man I am." "I know what kind of man you were," the sheriff said carefully. "Before. Before doesn't change now." "Doesn't it?" The sheriff glanced toward Clara again. "Vernon Brennan's a piece of trash, but he's still their blood. He could make noise if he wanted to." "Vernon Brennan took his money and ran," Caleb said coldly. "He doesn't get to make noise about anything." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "Look, Ward, I'm not here to cause trouble, but if those girls are being mistreated, they're not. Then you won't mind if I talk to them." Caleb's hand flexed at his side, and for a second Clara thought he might refuse. But then he stepped back and gestured toward the yard. "Be my guest." The sheriff walked over to Clara, his boots crunching on the gravel. Up close, he looked tired, worn down by years of dealing with things he couldn't fix. "Name's Sheriff Garrett," he said. "What's yours?" "Clara Brennan." "You the oldest?" "Yes, sir." Garrett nodded toward her sisters. "They doing all right?" Clara hesitated. She could feel Caleb watching from across the yard, could feel the weight of the question pressing down on her. If she said the wrong thing, would the sheriff take them away, send them back to Vernon? Or worse, split them up and send them to different families? "We're fine," she said carefully. "He treating you decent?" "Yes, sir." Garrett's eyes searched her face like he was trying to read between the lines. "You sure about that? Because if he's not, I can—" "He feeds us," Clara interrupted. "Clothes us. Gives us a place to sleep. He doesn't hit us. Doesn't—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Doesn't what?" "Doesn't do the things men like Vernon do." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "We're better off here." Garrett studied her a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "All right, but if that changes, you come find me. Understand?" "Yes, sir." He tipped his hat and walked back to Caleb, who hadn't moved an inch. They exchanged a few more words Clara couldn't hear, and then the sheriff mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. Caleb stood there for a moment, watching him go. Then he turned and walked back into the barn without a word. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. May appeared at her elbow, wringing water from a shirt. What did he want? "To make sure we're not being hurt." "Are we?" Clara looked at her sister, really looked at her. May's face had more color than it had 2 weeks ago. She wasn't as thin. Her eyes weren't as hollow. "No," Clara said. "We're not." "Then why does it feel like we are?" Clara didn't have an answer for that. That night, Caleb didn't come in for supper. Clara waited, keeping the stew warm over the fire, but he never showed. Finally, she dished out portions for her sisters and covered the pot, setting Caleb's bowl aside. After the younger girls went to bed, Clara sat at the table and stared into the dying fire. She told herself she should go to sleep, that it didn't matter where Caleb was or what he was doing, but the restlessness wouldn't leave her alone. She stood, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and stepped outside. The night was cool and clear, the sky thick with stars. Clara walked toward the barn, her footsteps soft on the packed dirt. Light seeped through the cracks in the barn door, a lantern, probably. She hesitated, then pushed the door open. Caleb sat on a hay bale near the back, sharpening a knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone filled the silence. He didn't look up. "You should be asleep," he said. "So should you." He made another pass with the knife, testing the edge with his thumb. "I don't sleep much." Clara stepped further inside, letting the door swing shut behind her. "Why not?" "None of your business. You made it my business when you bought us." Caleb finally looked up, his eyes catching the lantern light. "That's not how this works." "Then how does it work?" Clara crossed her arms. "You don't talk, you don't explain, you just give orders and expect us to follow." That's exactly how it works." "Why?" Caleb set the knife down and leaned back, his gaze hard. "You want to know why I bought you?" Clara's pulse quickened. "Yes." "Because no one else would have kept you together. Because I know what happens to girls like you when they get split up. And because I had the money and the space and no good reason not to." He picked the knife back up. "That answer your question?" "No," Clara said. "It doesn't tell me why you care." Caleb's jaw tightened. For a moment, Clara thought he might tell her to leave, but then he spoke, his voice low and rough. "I had a daughter once, about your age." Clara went still. "And a wife," Caleb continued, staring at the knife in his hand. "They died, fever, same as your folks, 5 years ago." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. "After that, I didn't see much point in anything," Caleb said. "Kept the ranch running because I didn't know what else to do. But it was just going through the motions." He looked up at Clara, and for the first time she saw something behind his eyes. Grief, maybe, or exhaustion. "Then I heard Vernon Brennan was selling off his nieces, and I thought about my daughter, about what would have happened to her if I'd been the one who died." Clara's throat tightened. "So I went to that auction," Caleb said, "and I made sure you stayed together. That's it. That's the whole story." "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly. "About your family." Caleb shook his head. "Don't be. It doesn't change anything." He went back to sharpening the knife, the conversation clearly over. But Clara didn't leave. She stood there, watching him, trying to reconcile the man in front of her with the one she'd been imagining for the past 2 weeks. "You saved us," she said finally. Caleb didn't look up. "I bought you. There's a difference. Not to me." He paused mid-stroke, then resumed sharpening. "Get some sleep, Clara." This time, she listened. The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and stepped outside to find Caleb near the corral, driving fence posts into the ground. His shirt was already damp with sweat despite the early hour. "What are you building?" she called out. "Bigger corral," Caleb said without stopping. "Need more space for the horses." Clara watched him for a moment, then walked over and picked up a post leaning against the fence. "Show me." Caleb glanced at her, then at the post in her hands. "You ever done this before?" "No, but I can learn." He studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Hold it steady, right there." Clara positioned the post where he pointed, bracing it with both hands while Caleb drove it into the ground with a heavy mallet. The impact jarred her arms, but she held firm. "Good," Caleb said. "Next one." They worked in silence, moving from post to post. It was hard, repetitive labor, but Clara found a strange satisfaction in it. There was something solid about building things, something that made sense in a way the rest of her life didn't. By midday, May and Ruth had joined them, helping to string wire between the posts. Lila sat in the shade with her doll, watching and occasionally fetching tools when asked. "Why do you need more horses?" Ruth asked, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Don't yet," Caleb said. "But I will." Why? Because this place is going to get bigger. Clara paused, hammer in hand. What do you mean? Caleb straightened and looked out across the ranch. There are more kids like you, orphans, ones nobody wants. If I can take in 4, I can take in more. Clara's stomach flipped. You're serious. Dead serious. But why? May asked. You already have us. Because it's the right thing to do, Caleb said simply. He picked up another post and moved on. Clara exchanged glances with her sisters. None of them knew what to say. Over the following weeks, the ranch began to change. Caleb worked from dawn until long past dark, repairing buildings, expanding pens, and stockpiling supplies. He took on odd jobs in town, hauling freight, breaking horses, whatever paid, and used the money to buy lumber, nails, and feed. Clara and her sisters fell into the rhythm of it. They learned to anticipate what Caleb needed before he asked. They stopped flinching when he raised his voice to be heard over the wind. They stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop. One evening, as Clara was washing dishes, Caleb came inside and set a wooden box on the table. What's this? Clara asked. Books, Caleb said. For you and your sisters. Clara opened the box and stared. Inside were a half-dozen worn books, primers, a Bible despite everything, a collection of folk tales, and a thick history text. Where did you get these? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Town. Woman at the general store was clearing out her attic. Caleb leaned against the wall. You girls know how to read? Some, Clara said. Our mother taught us before she died. Good. Keep at it. You're going to need it. For what? For running this place when I'm gone. Clara looked up sharply. What are you talking about? I'm not going to live forever, Caleb said matter-of-factly. And when I'm dead, someone's got to keep things running. Might as well be you. Clara didn't know what to say. The idea of Caleb dying, of this strange, steady presence disappearing from her life, made her chest tighten in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. That's not going to happen for a long time, she said. Caleb shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, you'll be ready. He walked out before she could respond, leaving Clara standing there with a box of books and a weight she didn't know how to carry. 2 months after they arrived, a young boy showed up at the ranch. He couldn't have been more than 8, dirty and hollow-eyed, with bruises on his arms and a split lip that was still healing. Caleb found him hiding in the barn, curled up in an empty stall. He didn't run when Caleb approached, didn't fight, just stared at him with the kind of exhaustion Clara recognized all too well. What's your name, Caleb asked. The boy didn't answer. Caleb crouched down, putting himself at eye level. You hungry? The boy hesitated, then nodded. Come on, then. Caleb led the boy inside, sat him down at the table, and put a bowl of stew in front of him. The boy ate like he hadn't seen food in days. Probably hadn't. Clara watched from the doorway, her sisters clustered behind her. Who is he? May whispered. I don't know, Clara said. When the boy finished eating, Caleb poured him a cup of water and sat down across from him. You got people? The boy shook his head. Where'd you come from? The boy's voice was hoarse and small. The workhouse, in town. Clara's stomach turned. She'd heard stories about the workhouse, a place where orphans and debtors were sent to labor until they paid off whatever the state claimed they owed. It was supposed to be a mercy. In reality, it was a slow death. How'd you get out? Caleb asked. Ran. The boy's eyes darted toward the door, like he expected someone to drag him back any second. They're going to come looking. Let them, Caleb said flatly. The boy blinked. You're not going to send me back? No. Why not? Caleb leaned back in his chair. Because I don't send kids back to places that hurt them. You can stay here if you want. Work, same as the girls. Earn your keep. The boy stared at him, disbelief and hope warring on his face. You mean it? I don't say things I don't mean. The boy's lower lip trembled, and for a moment Clara thought he might cry, but he just nodded, gripping the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing in the world. "What's your name?" Caleb asked again. "Thomas," the boy whispered. "Tommy." "All right, Tommy. Welcome to the ranch." Tommy settled in quickly, sleeping in the loft with Caleb and working alongside Clara in the barn. He didn't talk much, but he was quick and willing, always the first to volunteer for the hardest jobs. Clara found herself watching him the way she used to watch Lila, protective, worried, always waiting for something to go wrong. But Tommy thrived under Caleb's steady hand. He filled out, his bruises faded, and the hollow look in his eyes began to soften. One afternoon, while Clara and Tommy were mucking stalls, he stopped and looked at her. "You think he's going to keep us?" Tommy asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if he changes his mind? What if he decides we're too much trouble?" Clara leaned on her pitchfork. "He won't." "How do you know?" "Because he's not that kind of man." Tommy frowned. "What kind of man is he?" Clara thought about it. About the midnight visitors and the quiet grief and the way Caleb worked himself to the bone without complaint. About the books and the expanded corral and the boy he'd taken in without hesitation. "The kind who keeps his word," she said finally. Tommy seemed to consider this, then nodded and went back to work. Okay. A week later, the sheriff returned. This time, he brought 3 men with him, hard-looking types with rifles and badges. Caleb met them in the yard, his hand resting on his pistol. Clara stood on the porch with her sisters and Tommy, her heart pounding. "Ward," Sheriff Garrett said, "we need to talk." "So talk." One of the other men stepped forward. "You got a boy here, name of Thomas Hale." Caleb's expression didn't change. "What about him?" "He's property of the state. Ran from the workhouse. We're here to take him back." Tommy went rigid beside Clara. She reached out and grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. "He's not going back, Caleb said. The man's eyes narrowed. "That's not your decision?" "It is now." "You don't have legal claim to him." "Then give me one." Caleb's voice was cold and flat. "I'll pay whatever fee you want. Fill out whatever papers you need. But that boy's not going back to that place." The men exchanged glances. Sheriff Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "It's not that simple, us," Garrett said. "It is that simple," Caleb shot back. "You know what goes on in that workhouse. You know what they do to those kids. And you're standing here trying to drag one of them back because it's easier than doing the right thing. Watch your mouth, Ward." "Or what?" Caleb stepped closer, and Clara saw the same shift in his posture she'd seen before, controlled but dangerous. "You going to arrest me? For what? Feeding a starving kid? Giving him a place to sleep? For interfering with state property?" "He's not property. He's a child." The tension in the yard was thick enough to choke on. Clara's grip on Tommy's hand tightened. Beside her, May was holding Lila, who looked like she might start crying. Finally, the sheriff sighed. "Ward, I don't want to do this." "Then don't." Garrett looked at the other men, then back at Caleb. "If I walk away, they're going to send someone else. Someone who won't ask questions." "Let them," Caleb said. "I'll deal with it. You can't fight the state. Watch me." The standoff stretched out, brittle and tense. Then one of the men muttered something under his breath and turned to walk back to his horse. The other followed. Sheriff Garrett lingered a moment longer, his expression caught somewhere between frustration and resignation. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "No," Caleb said. "You are." Garrett shook his head and mounted his horse. The group rode off, leaving Caleb standing alone in the yard. Clara let out a shaky breath. Tommy was trembling beside her, his face pale. "He's not going to let them take me," Tommy said, more to himself than to anyone else. "No," Clara agreed. "He's not." Caleb turned and walked back toward the barn without a word. But Clara saw the set of his shoulders, the tightness in his jaw. He'd just made an enemy of the law, and she didn't know what that was going to cost him. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to her sisters breathe, and thinking about what Caleb had said. I'll deal with it. Like it was simple. Like standing up to the state was just another chore. She slipped out of bed and padded into the main room. Caleb was at the table, a lamp burning low beside him, papers spread out in front of him. What are you doing? Clara asked. Caleb glanced up, looking for a loophole. Clara moved closer and saw that the papers were legal documents, contracts, custody forms, property deeds. Where did you get these? Lawyer in town. Owed me a favor. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, looking more exhausted than Clara had ever seen him. There's got to be a way to make this legal, to claim guardianship or something. And if there's not? Caleb's jaw tightened. Then I'll figure something else out. Clara sat down across from him. Why are you doing this? You asked me that already. I'm asking again. Caleb set down the paper he was holding and looked at her. Because if I don't, who will? You think anyone else is going to stand up for kids like you and Tommy? Kids nobody wants? He shook his head. The world doesn't care about orphans. It grinds them up and spits them out and moves on. Someone's got to push back. Even if it cost you everything? Especially then. Clara stared at him, something shifting in her chest. She'd spent weeks trying to figure out Caleb's angle, waiting for him to show his true colors. But maybe this was his true color. Maybe he was exactly what he appeared to be. A man who'd lost everything and decided the only thing left worth doing was saving people who couldn't save themselves. You're going to get yourself killed, Clara said quietly. Probably. That doesn't scare you? Caleb leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant. I died 5 years ago when my family did. Everything since then has just been borrowed time. He looked at her. Might as well use it for something that matters. Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just sat there, watching him shuffle through papers in the lamplight, and wondered if she'd ever meet anyone as stubborn or as broken as Caleb Ward. The next few days were tense. Caleb didn't go into town, and he kept a rifle within reach at all times. Clara found herself watching the horizon, waiting for riders to appear, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But nothing happened. Tommy threw himself into work with renewed intensity, like he thought if he made himself useful enough, Caleb wouldn't regret keeping him. Clara tried to tell him it didn't work that way, but Tommy wouldn't listen. I have to earn it, he said, hauling another bucket of water from the well. You already have, Clara said. Not yet. She let it go. She understood the need to prove yourself. She felt it too. One afternoon, while Clara was mending a tear in one of the fences, a wagon rolled up the trail. Clara tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward the hammer hanging from her belt. But then she recognized the driver, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression. Caleb emerged from his barn and walked over to meet her. They spoke for a few minutes, their voices too low for Clara to hear. Then Caleb nodded and helped the woman down from the wagon. She walked around to the back and pulled aside a tarp, revealing 2 small figures huddled together, girls, maybe 7 and 9, with tangled hair and frightened eyes. Clara's breath caught. Caleb reached into the wagon and lifted the younger girl out, setting her on the ground gently. The older girl climbed down on her own, sticking close to her sister. The woman said something to Caleb, handed him a folded piece of paper, and climbed back onto the wagon. She drove off without another word. Caleb stood there holding the paper, looking down at the 2 new girls. Then he glanced at Clara. Get them inside, he said. Feed them. Clean them up. Clara nodded and hurried over. The girls flinched when she approached, but Clara crouched down and kept her voice soft. It's all right, she said. You're safe now. The younger girl started crying. The older one wrapped an arm around her and stared at Clara with hollow, mistrustful eyes. Clara understood that look. She'd worn it herself not so long ago. Come on, she said gently. Let's get you warm. She led them inside where May and Ruth were already heating water and pulling out clean clothes. Lila peeked out from behind the table, clutching her doll. The new girls stood in the middle of the room, trembling and uncertain. Clara knelt in front of them and met the older girl's eyes. What are your names? She asked. The girl hesitated. I'm Emma. This is my sister Jane. I'm Clara. These are my sisters, May, Ruth, and Lila. And that's Tommy. She gestured toward the boy who was hovering near the door watching. "You're going to stay here with us. It's hard work, but it's better than wherever you came from." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "You promise?" Clara thought about everything she'd learned in the past 2 months, about Caleb's grief and stubbornness and the way he'd stood up to the law for a boy he barely knew, about the books and the expanded corral and the quiet, relentless determination to build something that mattered. "I promise," Clara said. That night, after the new girls were asleep, Clara found Caleb outside, sitting on the porch steps and staring at the stars. She sat down beside him. "Where did they come from?" "Woman runs a boarding house in town," Caleb said. "Found them wandering the streets. Parents dead. No other family. She couldn't keep them, so she brought them here." "How did she know about us?" "Word gets around, huh?" Clara absorbed that. "There are going to be more, aren't there?" "Probably. Can we handle it?" Caleb glanced at her. "We'll have to." Clara looked out across the ranch at the expanded corral, the repaired barn, the garden they'd started planting, at the place that had gone from strange and frightening to something that almost felt like home. "We're going to need more beds," she said. "I know. And more food. I know. And more hands to help with the work." Caleb nodded. "That's why I'm counting on you." Clara turned to look at him. "Me? You're the oldest. The others look up to you. If this is going to work, I need you to lead them." "I'm 15, Clara said. "I don't know how to lead anyone." "You've been doing it since the day you stepped on that auction block," Caleb said. "You just didn't realize it." Clara's throat tightened. She thought about standing on that platform, holding May's hand and trying not to break, about the terror and the helplessness and the desperate need to keep her sisters together. She hadn't felt like a leader then. She'd felt like a girl drowning in a river she couldn't escape. But maybe Caleb was right. Maybe leadership wasn't about feeling ready. Maybe it was just about doing what needed to be done, even when you were scared out of your mind. "All right," Clara said quietly. "I'll try. That's all I'm asking." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars wheel overhead. The night was cool and still, the kind of stillness that felt like the world holding its breath. "Thank you," Clara said. Caleb glanced at her. "For what?" "For not giving up on us." Caleb looked away, his jaw working. "I should be thanking you." "For what?" "For reminding me what it feels like to have something worth fighting for." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just sat there, shoulder to shoulder with the man who'd bought her at auction and somehow given her a reason to believe the world wasn't entirely broken. And for the first time since her parents died, Clara felt something she hadn't dared to feel in a long, long time. Hope. By spring, the ranch held 9 children. Emma and Jane had been followed by a boy named Samuel with a twisted foot and a girl named Rose who didn't speak. Then came 2 brothers, Michael and Daniel, who'd been found sleeping in a stable after their father drank himself to death. And finally, a girl named Abigail, who showed up on foot one morning, bleeding from a gash on her forehead and refusing to say where she'd come from. Caleb took them all. No questions, no hesitation. He just made more space, stretched the food further, and kept working. Clara did the same. She organized the children into work rotations, assigned sleeping arrangements, and made sure everyone had clean clothes and enough to eat. It was exhausting. Some days she felt like she was holding the whole place together with sheer will and fraying rope. But she didn't complain. Caleb had asked her to lead, and she wasn't going to let him down. The ranch became something Clara had never seen before, a place that ran on structure and hard work, but also on something quieter, something that felt almost like family, even if none of them were related by blood. May took charge of the younger children, teaching them games and songs to ease the nightmares. Ruth managed the kitchen with surprising efficiency, making meals stretch and taste better than they had any right to. Tommy became Caleb's shadow, learning everything the man would teach him about horses and repairs and the kind of quiet competence that didn't need praise. Even Lila, the smallest of them all, found her place. She appointed herself caretaker of Rose, the silent girl, and spent hours sitting beside her, talking in a steady stream of one-sided conversation. Slowly, painfully, Rose began to respond, first with nods, then gestures, then finally a whispered word that made Lila cry with happiness. But not everything ran smooth. Michael and Daniel fought constantly, their grief spilling out in fists and shouted insults. Samuel struggled with work that required mobility, his twisted foot making him slow and clumsy. Abigail woke screaming most nights, thrashing so hard that Clara had to hold her down until she remembered where she was. And through it all, Caleb remained steady. He didn't coddle or comfort. He just kept showing up, kept working, kept making it clear through action rather than words that he wasn't going anywhere. One evening, after a particularly brutal day where half the chickens had escaped and Samuel had fallen trying to chase them, Clara found Caleb in the barn, examining a crack in one of the support beams. "We need help," Clara said without preamble. Caleb glanced at her. "What kind of help?" "Another adult, someone who can handle the younger ones while I deal with the older ones. Someone who knows how to cook better than Ruth. Someone who—" Clara stopped, realizing how desperate she sounded. "We're barely keeping up." Caleb straightened, wiping sawdust from his hands. "I know." "Then do something about it." "Like what? Hire someone? With what money?" Caleb's voice was flat but not unkind. "We're already stretched thin. Then we stop taking in more kids." The words came out harsher than Clara intended. Caleb's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "You want me to turn them away?" he said. "I want us to survive," Clara shot back. "We can't save everyone, Caleb. We're going to break." "Then we break." Clara stared at him. "That's your answer? It's the only answer I've got." Caleb set down the tool he'd been holding. "You think I don't know we're drowning? You think I don't see how hard you're working, how tired everyone is? I see it. But what's the alternative? Tell the next kid who shows up that we're full? Watch them walk away and hope someone else takes them in?" He shook his head. "I can't do that." "Why not?" "Because I already did, 5 years ago." Caleb's voice went hard. "After my wife and daughter died, a neighbor came by with a boy, maybe 10 years old, orphaned, needed a place to stay. And I said no. Told myself I couldn't handle it, that I had too much to deal with already. Sent him away." Claire's chest tightened. "Found out later he ended up in the workhouse," Caleb continued. "Didn't last a year, worked himself sick, and died." He met Clara's eyes. "So no, I'm not turning anyone away. Not ever again." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to make him see reason, but she recognized the look on his face. The same stubborn determination that had made him stand up to the sheriff, the same grief that drove everything he did. "We're going to need more than willpower," she said quietly. "I know," Caleb said. "I'm working on it." That was all he'd give her. Clara left the barn feeling more exhausted than when she'd entered. 2 days later, a woman arrived at the ranch, driving a wagon loaded with supplies. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything twice. Caleb met her in the yard, and Clara watched from the porch as they spoke. The woman gestured sharply, her voice carrying across the distance even if the words didn't. Caleb listened, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, and the woman climbed down from the wagon. Caleb walked over to Clara. "This is Margaret Hale. She's going to be staying here." Clara blinked. "What?" "You said we needed help. Here it is." Caleb turned and headed back toward the barn, clearly considering the matter settled. Margaret approached the porch, her boots heavy on the steps. She looked Clara up and down with the kind of assessment that made Clara feel like she was being inventoried. "You're the one running things," Margaret said. It wasn't a question. "I'm trying," Clara said carefully. "Trying's not the same as doing." Margaret set her hands on her hips. "How many children?" 9, including me and my sisters." "Ages?" 6 to 15. Margaret nodded like she was calculating something. "I'll need a full accounting of supplies, work schedules, and sleeping arrangements by tonight. Tomorrow we're reorganizing everything." Clara bristled. "I've already organized—" "I'm sure you have, but I've been running households longer than you've been alive, girl. If Caleb Ward thinks this place is going to turn into a proper refuge, it needs more than good intentions." Margaret's gaze softened slightly. "You've done well, but you're 15 and exhausted. Let me help." Clara wanted to argue. wanted to tell this stranger that they were managing fine, but the truth was, they weren't. And the thought of handing even a small part of the burden to someone else made Clara's knees weak with relief. "All right," Clara said. Margaret nodded. "Good. Now show me around." Margaret Hale was a force. Within a week, she'd reorganized the kitchen, established stricter meal times, and implemented a cleaning rotation that actually got followed. She taught Ruth how to make bread that didn't come out like rocks, and showed May techniques for settling the younger children that didn't involve Clara having to intervene every 5 minutes. But she was also hard. She didn't tolerate excuses or half efforts. When Michael tried to skip his chores, Margaret put him on double duty. When Abigail threw a tantrum over having to share a bed, Margaret let her sleep on the floor until she changed her mind. "You're too soft with them, Pike," Margaret told Clara one evening while they were folding laundry. Clara frowned. "I'm not soft. I make them work." "You make them work, but you also let them get away with things because you feel sorry for them." Margaret shook out a shirt with more force than necessary. "Sympathy's fine, but it won't teach them how to survive. They've already survived plenty. Surviving and thriving are different things." Margaret pinned Clara with a look. "You want these children to make it in the world. Then stop treating them like they're broken. Treat them like they're capable." It stung, but Clara knew Margaret was right. She'd been so focused on keeping everyone together that she hadn't thought about what came after, about preparing them for a world that wouldn't care about their trauma or their past. "How do I do that, Clara asked. "Same way Caleb did with you," Margaret said. "Expect more." Expecting more turns out to be harder than Clara anticipated. The children pushed back, unused to someone demanding as much as Margaret did. Samuel complained his foot hurt too much to work. Rose retreated into silence again. Michael and Daniel's fights got worse instead of better. But Margaret didn't bend. She just kept pushing, kept demanding, kept making it clear that effort mattered more than results. Slowly, things began to change. Samuel figured out ways to work around his injury, developing a hobbling efficiency that got things done. Rose started responding to Margaret's clipped instructions, finding comfort in the structure. Michael and Daniel were separated and given different tasks, which reduced their fighting to occasional scuffles rather than daily brawls. Clara watched it happen with a mix of admiration and resentment. Part of her was grateful for Margaret's help. Another part resented how easily the older woman had stepped in and fixed things Clara had been struggling with for months. One afternoon, while Clara was hauling water, Margaret fell into step beside her. "You're angry with me," Margaret said. Clara nearly dropped the bucket. "I'm not. Don't lie. It's beneath you." Margaret took the bucket from Clara's hands and carried it herself. "You think I came in and made you look incompetent?" Clara's face flushed. It's all right to feel that way. You've been holding this place together through sheer determination, and now someone's telling you it wasn't enough. That's hard to swallow." Clara stopped walking. "Then why are you saying it?" "Because it's true, and because you're smart enough to learn from it." Margaret set the bucket down and turned to face Clara. "You did an incredible job keeping these children alive and fed. But alive and fed isn't the same as prepared. That's not a failure on your part. You're 15 and you did what you could, but now you have help. Use it." Clara swallowed hard. "I don't want to let Caleb down. You're not letting anyone down. You're growing up. There's a difference." Margaret picked up the bucket again. "Come on, we've got work to do." Spring turned into summer, and the ranch continued to grow. Not in children, Caleb held firm at 9, recognizing their limits, but in structure and capability. Margaret's influence turned the place from a collection of traumatized kids barely scraping by into something that resembled an actual functioning household. Routines became rituals. Meals happened at set times. Chores were divided fairly. Arguments were settled quickly and without violence. It wasn't perfect. Nothing involving 9 damaged children ever could be. But it was better, stronger. Clara found herself with more time to think, and with thinking came questions about what they were building, about whether it would last, about what happened to children like them when they grew up and had nowhere else to go. She brought these questions to Caleb one evening while they were repairing a section of fence. "What happens when we're too old to stay here, Saul?" Clara asked. Caleb drove a nail into wood with 3 precise strikes. What do you mean? I mean, I'm 15, May's 12. Eventually we're going to be adults, then what? Then you decide what you want to do. And if we want to stay? Caleb glanced at her. Then you stay. As what? Workers? As partners. Caleb set down his hammer. This place isn't mine, Clara. It's ours. All of us. You think I could run it without you? Without Margaret or Tommy or any of the others? He shook his head. I'm just the one who started it, but it belongs to everyone who helps build it. Clara absorbed that. You're serious. Always am. So what are we building exactly? Caleb was quiet for a moment, looking out across the ranch. Something different, a place where kids like you don't have to be afraid, where they can learn and work and become whoever they're supposed to be. He picked up his hammer again. A refuge. That's a big word. It's a big idea. Caleb started on another nail. Probably too big, but we're doing it anyway. Clara smiled despite herself. You really don't do anything small, do you? Didn't see the point. They worked in silence for a while, the sound of hammering filling the air. Clara thought about auctions and fear and the hollow feeling of being unwanted. Then she thought about Stu and books and 9 children who'd found their way to a place that didn't give up on them. Maybe Caleb was right. Maybe it was too big an idea. But maybe that was exactly why it mattered. In late summer, trouble found them again. This time it came in the form of Vernon Brennan. Clara was in the garden when she saw him riding up the trail, and her whole body went cold. She recognized the slouch of his shoulders, the way he sat his horse like he owned the world. Behind him rode 2 other men, both armed. Clara dropped the basket she was carrying and ran for the house. Caleb! He emerged from the barn already moving, his hand on his pistol. He saw Vernon, and his expression went flat and dangerous. Get the children inside, Caleb said without looking at Clara. Now. Clara didn't argue. She herded May, Ruth, and Lila into the house, then went back for the others. Margaret was already gathering them, her face grim. All of you inside, Margaret ordered. Don't come out until we say. Vernon dismounted in the yard, grinning like he'd just won a hand of cards. Well now, if it isn't Caleb Ward. Heard you've been busy. Leave calm, Caleb said flatly. That's not very hospitable. Vernon spat into the dirt. I came all this way to see my nieces. Family reunion and all. They're not your family, not anymore. Vernon's grin widened. Now that's where you're wrong. Blood's blood, Ward. The law says those girls belong with their kin, and I'm their kin. You sold them. I facilitated a transaction, but I've been thinking, maybe I acted too hasty. Maybe I should have kept them after all. Vernon's eyes drifted toward the house. Seems like you've got a whole operation going here. Must be profitable. Clara watched from the window, her heart pounding. She could see the calculation in Vernon's eyes, the same greedy look he'd had when he'd dragged them to the auction. This isn't about the girls, Caleb said. It's about money. Everything's about money. Vernon gestured to the men behind him. These here are my associates. We're prepared to take custody of my nieces, unless you'd like to make me an offer. How much? Vernon pretended to think. Well, considering what you paid before and accounting for their upkeep these past few months, let's say $200. Clara's stomach dropped. $200. That was more than Caleb could possibly have. And if I don't pay? Caleb asked. Then we take the girls. By force if necessary. Vernon's hand drifted toward his gun. Your choice, Ward. The tension in the yard was suffocating. Clara could see Caleb calculating, weighing options. She knew he'd fight if he had to, but 3 armed men against 1 were bad odds, even for someone as capable as Caleb. Then Margaret stepped out of the house. She walked down the porch steps with the kind of authority that made even Vernon pause. In her hand, she carried a shotgun, held with the ease of someone who knew exactly how to use it. Mr. Brennan, Margaret said pleasantly, I suggest you leave. Vernon's grin faltered. Now wait just a minute. No. Margaret raised the shotgun, not quite aiming, but making her point clear. You sold those girls. You gave up any claim to them the moment you took Caleb's money. Coming back now to extort more is bad business. Worse, it's cowardly. One of Vernon's men shifted uncomfortably. The other put his hand on his pistol. You're making a mistake, lady, Vernon said. The only mistake would be you not getting back on your horse. Margaret's voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. Leave now, and we'll forget you were here. Stay, and I promise you'll regret it. Vernon looked between Margaret and Caleb, his expression caught between anger and calculation. Finally, he spat again and mounted his horse. This isn't over, he said. Yes, it is, Caleb replied. Come back here again, and I won't bother with warnings. Vernon glared at him, then wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. Margaret didn't lower the shotgun until they were out of sight. Then she let out a long breath and leaned the weapon against the porch rail. That man's going to be trouble, she said. I know, Caleb replied. Clara emerged from the house, her legs shaking. He's going to come back. Probably, Caleb agreed, but not alone. Next time he'll bring the law, or more men. We need to be ready. How? Clara demanded. How do we fight the law? We don't fight them, Margaret said. We become legitimate. Caleb nodded slowly. Legal guardianship, proper papers. Make it official so men like Vernon can't challenge it. That takes time, Margaret said, and money. Then we find both. Caleb looked at Clara. This is what I was working on, before Vernon showed up. I've been talking to a lawyer about setting up a formal structure, something that makes this place a recognized institution rather than just a ranch. Clara's mind raced. Like an orphanage? Something like that, but different. A place with legal standing, where children have rights and protections. Caleb's jaw tightened. It won't be easy. The state doesn't like giving up control, but it's the only way to make sure Vernon or anyone like him can't take you away. Clara thought about the auction block, about standing there while men bid on her and her sisters like livestock, about the terror of being separated, of losing the only family she had left. Then we do it, Clara said. Whatever it takes. The process of becoming legitimate was slow and frustrating. Caleb spent weeks in town, meeting with lawyers and filing paperwork. Margaret organized their records, documenting every child's arrival and circumstances. Clara helped where she could, writing out testimonials and keeping detailed logs of their daily operations. The cost was staggering. Legal fees, filing expenses, inspections. It all added up faster than they could earn it. Caleb took on every job he could find, working himself past exhaustion. Margaret sold her wagon and donated the money. Clara and the older children did odd jobs for neighbors, earning pennies that slowly accumulated into dollars. It still wasn't enough. One night, Clara found Caleb at the table, papers spread out in front of him, his face haggard. We're short, he said without looking up, by almost $100. Clara's heart sank. What do we do? I don't know. Caleb rubbed his face. I've borrowed all I can, sold everything that's not essential. There's nothing left. Clara stared at the papers, her mind working. Then she thought of something. The land. Caleb looked up sharply. What? We're not using all of it. The eastern section, there's nothing there but grass and rocks. What if we sold part of it? That land's the buffer. If we sell it, we're right up against other properties. No room to expand. We don't need to expand right now. We need to survive. Clara leaned forward. Sell what we don't need today to protect what we do. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. It could work, if I can find a buyer. You will, Clara said with more confidence than she felt. Caleb found a buyer, a rancher looking to expand his grazing land. The sale went through quickly, and the money was enough to cover the remaining fees with a little left over for supplies. 3 months after Vernon's visit, the papers came through. The Ward Refuge for Displaced Children was officially recognized by the state of Kansas, with Caleb Ward listed as director and Clara Brennan as assistant director. Margaret was registered as head matron. Every child was documented with official guardianship papers, making it illegal for anyone to remove them without cause. The day the papers arrived, Caleb gathered everyone in the main room and explained what it meant. "This place is legitimate now," he said. "You're not just orphans someone took pity on. You're part of something official, something that has legal protection." He looked at each of them in turn. "You're safe here, as safe as I can make you." Tommy raised his hand tentatively. "Does that mean Vernon can't take the girls?" "It means Vernon can try, but he'll lose." Caleb's expression was hard. "And if he shows his face here again, he'll have more to worry about than legal paperwork." Clara felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying since the auction block. They weren't completely safe. Nowhere was completely safe. But they were protected, recognized, real. That night, Clara sat on the porch steps and looked out at the ranch. The buildings were still weathered, the land still harsh, but lights glowed in the windows, and she could hear voices inside, May singing, Ruth laughing, Margaret giving instructions. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. "You did good," Caleb said, sitting down beside her. "We did good," Clara corrected. Caleb nodded. They sat in silence, watching the stars emerge. "What happens now, Clara asked. "Now we keep going, keep building." Caleb leaned back against the post. "The hard part's just starting. Official recognition means inspections, regulations, people watching to make sure we're doing things right. We're going to have to prove this works." "It already works." "Then we prove it to everyone else." Clara thought about that, about the weight of expectations and the scrutiny that came with legitimacy. Part of her missed the early days when it was just them against the world, no one watching or judging, but only a small part. "We can do it," Clara said. I know we can," Caleb replied. "Question is whether we should." Clara looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, this is bigger than just us now. If we succeed, other people might try the same thing. Build their own refuges, help their own kids." Caleb's voice was quiet. "But if we fail, we prove the state right. That orphans should stay in workhouses and on auction blocks. That people like me shouldn't be trusted with them." "We're not going to fail." "You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Clara met his eyes. "Because failure isn't an option. Not for any of us." Caleb held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, something like pride flickering across his face. "All right then," he said. "Let's make sure the world knows what we're capable of." The first inspection came 6 weeks after they received official recognition. A man from the state arrived in a pressed suit and polished shoes, carrying a leather folder and an expression that suggested he'd already decided they were failing before he stepped foot on the property. His name was Howard Finch, and he made it clear within the first 5 minutes that he considered the Ward Refuge an experiment destined to collapse. "Let's start with accommodations," Finch said, pulling out a pencil. "How many children per room?" 4 in the main room, 5 in the addition we built," Margaret answered. She'd insisted on handling the inspection herself, keeping Caleb and Clara out of sight. "Each child has their own bed and storage." Finch peered into the sleeping quarters, his nose wrinkling slightly. "Cramped." "Functional," Margaret corrected. "And the washing facilities?" "Basin and pump outside. We heat water for baths twice weekly." Finch made a note. "That's insufficient for proper hygiene. It's what we can manage with current resources." The inspection continued like that for 2 hours. Finch finding fault, Margaret defending their choices with the patience of someone who'd dealt with difficult men her entire life. Clara watched from the porch, her nails digging into her palms. "He's going to shut us down," May whispered beside her. "No, he's not," Clara said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. When Finch finally finished, he stood in the yard and flipped through his notes. "The children appear healthy and adequately fed. The property is maintained, but there are significant deficiencies. The sleeping arrangements are substandard, the bathing facilities are primitive, and I have concerns about the educational curriculum." "We teach them to read and write," Margaret said, "along with practical skills, cooking, animal husbandry, basic mathematics. That's not a proper education. It's more than most orphans get. Finch snapped his folder shut. I'm recommending conditional approval. You have 6 months to address the deficiencies. If you don't, this facility will be closed and the children redistributed to state institutions. Clara felt her stomach drop. 6 months. That was barely any time at all. Margaret's expression didn't change. We'll be ready. After Finch left, Caleb emerged from the barn where he'd been deliberately staying out of the way. How bad? Bad enough. Margaret ticked off items on her fingers. We need better sleeping arrangements, proper bathing facilities, and someone qualified to teach a formal curriculum, all within 6 months. That's impossible, Clara said. It's what we've got. Caleb's jaw was set. So we figure it out. Tommy, who'd been listening from the doorway, spoke up. What happens if we don't? They take you away, Caleb said bluntly. Put you in workhouses or institutions. Maybe split you up. The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate. Then we don't fail, Clara said. The next 6 months became a blur of construction and scrambling. Caleb threw himself into building an addition to the house, a proper dormitory with individual sleeping spaces instead of shared rooms. He worked through rainstorms and cold snaps, his hands raw and bleeding, refusing to stop even when Margaret told him he'd work himself into the ground. Money was a constant problem. They needed materials, supplies, someone to help with the building. Caleb took on more jobs, disappearing for days at a time to work freight hauling or horsebreaking. He came back exhausted and sunburned, pockets heavy with coins that immediately got spent on lumber and nails. Clara picked up the slack at the ranch, managing the daily operations with Margaret's help. She was 16 now, no longer the terrified girl from the auction block. The work had hardened her, made her capable in ways she hadn't known were possible. She could manage accounts, settle disputes, make decisions that affected 9 other lives without her hands shaking. But the weight was crushing. Some nights she lay awake calculating costs, trying to figure out how to stretch resources that were already stretched past breaking. She thought about what would happen if they failed, about Tommy back in the workhouse, about Emma and Jane separated, about Lila in some institution where no one cared if she cried at night. You're going to worry yourself sick, May said one evening, finding Clara at the table with papers spread everywhere. I'm fine. You're not sleeping. You barely eat. That's not fine. May sat down across from her. We're all scared, Clara, but you don't have to carry it alone. Someone has to. Why you? Clara looked at her sister. Because Caleb asked me to lead. He asked you to help, not to kill yourself. May reached across and took Clara's hand. We're going to make it. We always do. Clara wanted to believe that, but belief felt like a luxury they couldn't afford. The bathing facilities proved to be the easiest problem to solve. Caleb designed a bathhouse with a wood-burning stove to heat water and a drainage system that emptied outside the main living areas. It was simple but effective, and building it gave the older children, Tommy, Michael, Daniel, something tangible to contribute to. They worked together, mixing mortar and laying stones. And somewhere in the process, the constant fighting between Michael and Daniel eased, not disappeared, but softened into something that looked almost like partnership. You think it'll be enough? Michael asked one afternoon while they were fitting the stovepipe. Has to be, Tommy said. What if it's not? Tommy drove a nail with more force than necessary. Then we fight harder. Michael glanced at him. You really think Caleb would fight the state for us? He already has, multiple times. But what if they don't give him a choice? Tommy set down his hammer and looked Michael in the eye. Then we give them hell. All of us. Clara, overhearing from where she was hauling water, felt something fierce and protective surge in her chest. These kids had been broken when they arrived, scared and damaged and barely holding together. But they were different now, stronger. They'd found something worth fighting for, and that changed everything. The education requirement was harder. They needed someone qualified to teach a proper curriculum, reading, writing, arithmetic, history. Someone the state would approve. But teachers cost money they didn't have, and most wouldn't want to work at a place like this anyway. Margaret suggested they contact churches or charitable organizations, But Caleb shut that down immediately. "We're not taking charity with strings attached," he said. "Last thing we need is someone trying to convert the kids or pushing an agenda." "Then what do you suggest?" Margaret asked, her patience wearing thin. "I'll figure something out." "You can't solve everything alone, Caleb. Watch me." They argued more frequently now, the stress fraying tempers. Margaret thought Caleb was being stubborn to the point of self-destruction. Caleb thought Margaret was too willing to compromise their independence. Clara found herself caught in the middle, trying to mediate while managing her own mounting anxiety. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One afternoon, a young woman arrived at the ranch on foot, carrying a worn satchel and looking half-starved. Her name was Eleanor Pritchard, and she'd been teaching at a school in town until the schoolmaster decided women had no business educating children. "I heard you might need a teacher," Eleanor said, standing in the yard with her chin raised despite the desperation in her eyes. "I can teach reading, writing, arithmetic, history, and basic science. I have references." Margaret looked her over. "What's the catch?" "No catch. I need work. You need a teacher. I don't require much, just room and board." "Why here?" Caleb asked. "You could find another school." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Schools won't hire a woman who got fired for teaching girls mathematics. Said it was inappropriate. That girls should learn needlework and housekeeping, not numbers." She gestured around the ranch. "You're building something different here. I'd like to be part of it." Caleb and Margaret exchanged glances. Then Caleb nodded. "You can stay, but the work's hard and the kids are difficult. You'll earn that room and board." "I wouldn't expect anything less." Eleanor moved into a corner of the barn that Caleb converted into a small room, and within a week she'd established a formal schooling schedule. Mornings were dedicated to academics, reading, writing, arithmetic. Afternoons remained focused on practical work. It wasn't perfect, but it was structured and legitimate enough to satisfy the state's requirements. Clara found herself studying alongside the younger children, filling gaps in her own education. Eleanor noticed and started assigning her additional readings, pushing her harder than the others. "You're clever," Eleanor said one afternoon while reviewing Clara's work. "You could do more than manage a ranch." Clara looked up from the book she'd been reading. "Like what?" "University, a profession, teaching, maybe, or law." Eleanor tapped the page. "You have a mind for it." The idea was so foreign that Clara almost laughed. "Girls like me don't go to university." "Girls like you didn't run refuges either, but here you are." Eleanor's expression was serious. "Don't limit yourself based on what other people think is possible." Clara didn't know what to say to that, so she just went back to her reading, Eleanor's words lodging somewhere deep in her chest where they refused to be ignored. 4 months into the 6-month deadline, Caleb came back from town with news. Vernon Brennan had been arrested for fraud and theft. He'd tried to run the same scheme on another family, selling their children and then attempting to extort money by demanding them back. But this time the father had connections and resources. Vernon was in jail awaiting trial. "He's not getting out," Sheriff Garrett told Caleb at the general store, loud enough that several people overheard. "Judge is throwing the book at him." The news spread through the ranch like wildfire. Clara felt a weight lift that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Vernon had been a shadow hanging over everything, a constant threat that he might return. Now that shadow was gone. That night, they had something close to a celebration. Margaret made extra portions of stew. Eleanor led the children in songs. Even Caleb allowed himself a rare smile, but Clara couldn't fully relax. They still had 2 months to meet the inspection requirements. The dormitory was finished but needed furnishing. The bathhouse was functional but rough around the edges, and they were still scraping by on resources that never stretched far enough. "One problem at a time," Margaret told her, seeing the worry on Clara's face. "Vernon's gone. That's enough for tonight." Clara nodded, but sleep didn't come easily. Maitim. The second inspection arrived exactly 6 months after the first. Howard Finch returned with the same pressed suit and the same critical eye. But this time Clara thought she detected something different in his expression. Not warmth exactly, but maybe a grudging respect. He toured the new dormitory, running his hand along the walls and testing the beds. He inspected the bathhouse. checking the stove and drainage. He observed Eleanor's classroom, watching the children recite lessons and demonstrate their arithmetic. Then he sat down with Caleb, Margaret, and Clara in the main room and reviewed his notes. "The sleeping arrangements are adequate," Finch said. "The bathing facilities meet minimum standards. The educational curriculum is appropriate." He paused, and Clara's heart hammered in her throat. "However," Clara's stomach dropped. She'd known there would be a however. "The financial sustainability concerns me," Finch continued. "You're operating on a razor-thin margin. One bad season, one unexpected expense, and this entire operation could collapse." "We're aware," Caleb said flatly. "Are you?" Finch set down his folder. "Because, from where I'm sitting, you're one disaster away from proving all your critics right, that these children would be better off in state institutions." "They wouldn't be," Clara said before she could stop herself. "Sir?" Finch looked at her. "And you are?" "Clara Brennan, Assistant Director." "You're 16. 17 next month, and I've been helping run this place since it started." Clara straightened her spine. "The state institutions don't care about these children. They work them until they break and call it rehabilitation. Here, they have family, structure, people who actually give a damn if they survive." "Language, Miss Brennan. I apologize for the language, not for the sentiment." Finch studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth twitched. "You remind me of someone, my daughter. She has the same fire." He picked up his folder again. "Very well. I'm granting full approval for another year, but I'm also filing a recommendation that the state provide modest funding to support this facility. No guarantees, but it might help with your financial concerns." Clara's breath caught. "You're approving us?" "Conditionally, you'll receive quarterly inspections. Fail to maintain standards and approval will be revoked immediately." Finch stood. "But yes, the Ward Refuge is officially recognized as a legitimate institution for the care and education of displaced children." After he left, the ranch erupted. The children cheered. Margaret allowed herself a rare laugh. Even Caleb looked relieved, though he tried to hide it. Clara stepped outside, needing air and space to process what had just happened. They'd done it. Against every odd, every obstacle, every person who said it was impossible, they'd done it. Tommy found her sitting on the porch steps. "We won," he said, sitting beside her. "We survived," Clara corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Clara thought about that. "I don't know. Maybe not." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the prairie. The land looked different now than it had a year ago. More built up, more permanent, more like home. "Thank you," Tommy said quietly. Claire looked at him. "For what?" "For not giving up. On any of us." Tommy's voice was steady, but his eyes were bright. "I know it was hard. I know there were times you probably wanted to quit. But you didn't." "I thought about it," Clara admitted. "More than once." "But you didn't." "No, I didn't. Why not?" Clara considered the question. She thought about the auction block and Caleb's steady presence and the slowly growing realization that sometimes the only way to survive was to build something worth surviving for. "Because you deserved better," Clara said finally. "All of you. And someone had to make sure you got it." The state funding came through 3 months later. Not a fortune, but enough to ease the constant financial strain. They used it to buy livestock, expand the garden, and stockpile supplies for winter. For the first time since the refuge started, they had a buffer, room to breathe. With breathing room came growth. Word spread about the Ward Refuge, and people started showing up, some bringing children who needed homes, others offering help or donations. A farmer donated a milk cow. A seamstress taught Ruth and May how to make proper clothes. A blacksmith took Tommy and Michael as apprentices 1 day a week, teaching them a trade. The refuge was becoming part of the community rather than an isolated experiment. People who'd been skeptical began to see it as something valuable, something that filled a need the state couldn't or wouldn't address. But success brought new challenges. More children meant more mouths to feed, more disputes to settle, more logistics to manage. Clara found herself stretched even thinner, trying to balance the daily operations with the long-term planning that Caleb insisted she learn. "You're going to run this place someday," Caleb told her one evening while they were reviewing accounts. "I'm not ready." "You'll never feel ready. That's not the point." Caleb pushed a ledger across the table. "The point is being capable, and you are." Clara looked at the numbers, income, expenses, projections for the next year. She'd learned to read these books the way she'd learned to read people, seeing past the surface to the deeper patterns beneath. "What happens when you're gone?" Clara asked. "Same thing that happens when I'm here. You make decisions, you keep things running, you adapt when circumstances change." Caleb leaned back. "This place isn't about me, Clara. It never was. I just got it started." "That's not true." "It is." Caleb's expression was serious. "I'm 43. I could live another 30 years or die tomorrow. Either way, this place needs to outlast me. That means building something that doesn't depend on any one person." Clara hated thinking about Caleb dying. He'd become the closest thing to a father she'd had since her own died. The idea of running the refuge without him felt impossible. "I don't want to do this alone," Clara said quietly. "You won't be. You'll have Margaret, Eleanor, Tommy and May, and all the others." Caleb's voice softened slightly. "You'll have what I didn't when I lost my family. You'll have people who understand what you're fighting for." Clara swallowed hard. "What if I fail?" "Then you fail, and you get up and try again." Caleb stood, gathering the ledgers. "Failure's not the worst thing that can happen. Giving up is." Winter came hard that year. Snow piled high, and temperatures dropped below anything Clara had experienced. They burned through firewood faster than anticipated, and food supplies ran lower than comfortable. But they managed. They'd learned how to manage. The children handled the cold better than expected. They'd grown tougher over the past year, more resilient. Rose, who'd been silent for months after arriving, now chattered constantly. Samuel had gained enough strength that his twisted foot barely slowed him down. Even Abigail's nightmares had faded to occasional bad dreams rather than nightly terrors. One evening, while a blizzard raged outside, Clara gathered everyone in the main room. They sat around the fire, wrapped in blankets, and Eleanor suggested they each share something they were grateful for. The responses varied. Lila said she was grateful for her doll. Ruth said food. Michael said the bathhouse, which made everyone laugh. When it was Clara's turn, she looked around the room at the faces illuminated by firelight, young and old, scared and brave, damaged and healing. She thought about the journey from the auction block to this moment, about everything they'd survived and built together. "I'm grateful we found each other," Clara said simply. Tommy nodded. "Even when it's hard?" "Especially then." Later that night, after the children were asleep, Clara found Caleb outside checking on the animals. Snow fell steadily, muffling sound and turning the world white and quiet. "You should be inside, kids," Caleb said without turning. "So should you." Animals need tending. Clara joined him anyway, helping spread extra hay and making sure the water wasn't frozen. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that came from months of shared labor. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked. "Starting this place?" Caleb paused, then continued working. "I regret not starting it sooner." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was drowning in grief and convinced nothing mattered anymore." He secured a gate and turned to face her. "You know what changed my mind? It was hearing about you and your sisters on that auction block, and realizing that if I didn't do something, you'd end up like that boy I turned away. Another casualty of a world that doesn't care." Clara's throat tightened. "You saved us. You saved yourselves. I just gave you a place to do it." Caleb started back toward the house, then stopped. "Clara, when I'm gone, and I will be eventually, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Don't let this place become what I ran from. Don't let it become so focused on survival that you forget why you started surviving in the first place." His breath formed clouds in the cold air. "Keep it about the children, always, no matter how hard it gets." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. They walked back to the house together, leaving footprints in the fresh snow that would be covered by morning. Spring arrived with mud and new beginnings. 3 more children came to the refuge, 2 boys and a girl, all under 10, all carrying the same haunted look Clara remembered from her own arrival. She helped settle them in, showing them the rhythms of the place and making sure they understood they were safe. "Does it ever stop?" one of the new boys asked her. "Being scared?" Clara thought about it. "No, but it gets easier, and eventually you're scared of different things." "Like what?" "Like failing the people who depend on you. Like not being strong enough when it matters." Clara smiled slightly. "But that kind of scared makes you better instead of smaller." The boy seemed to consider this, then nodded and went to join the others. Eleanor found Clara later. "You're good with them." "I remember what it was like." "That's what makes you good." Eleanor handed Clara a book. "I thought you might want this. It's about women's education reform. I think you'd find it interesting." Clara took the book, surprised. "Thank you." "You're welcome." "And Clara?" Eleanor's expression turned serious. "You have options. Don't forget that. This place is important, but it's not the only thing you could do with your life. It's the thing I choose to do. Just make sure it stays a choice." The conversation unsettled Clara in ways she couldn't articulate. She'd never really thought about having options before. Her life had been survival, then the refuge, then more survival. The idea that she could choose something else felt foreign, almost threatening. That night she mentioned it to May, who'd grown into a confident 13-year-old with strong opinions about everything. "Would you leave?" May asked. "If you could?" "I don't know." "I would," May said. "Not forever. But I'd like to see what else is out there. Maybe come back when I'm older and help run things. But I'd like to choose it, instead of just defaulting to it because it's all I know." Clara understood that. She'd been so focused on building the refuge that she hadn't stopped to consider whether it was what she wanted or just what she'd committed to. "Do you think that makes us ungrateful?" Clara asked. "I think it makes us human." May leaned against Clara's shoulder. "Caleb didn't save us so we'd be trapped here. He saved us so we'd have choices. Maybe it's okay to actually make them." Clara let that settle over her like the blanket they shared. Maybe May was right. Maybe choosing to stay was different than staying because you had no other option. Maybe that difference mattered, but for now, with spring arriving and new children settling in and the refuge growing stronger every day, Clara's choice was clear. She was needed here, and that was enough. 2 years after the auction block, Clara stood in the yard of the Ward Refuge watching a wagon roll up the trail. She was 18 now, tall and steady, in a way that came from carrying weight until you learned how to distribute it properly. The girl who'd trembled on that platform was still there somewhere, buried under layers of competence and responsibility. But she felt distant, like someone Clara used to know. The wagon carried a family, mother, father, 3 children. The father climbed down first, helped his wife, then lifted down 2 girls and a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. They looked around this ranch with wide eyes, taking in the expanded buildings, the fenced pastures, the children working in the garden. "We heard about this place," the father said when Caleb approached. "Heard you take in children who need homes." "We do," Caleb said, "but only orphans. Children with no other options." The mother's face crumpled. "Please, we can't feed them. The drought killed our crops. We have nothing left." Her voice broke. "If we keep them, they'll starve. All of us will." Clara felt her stomach clench. This was different from the usual arrivals. Abandoned children, runaways, kids pulled from institutions. These were parents making an impossible choice. Caleb's expression didn't change, but Clara saw something flicker in his eyes. Grief, maybe. Or understanding that came from standing in similar wreckage. "How old are they?" Caleb asked. 8, 6, and 5. "They know you're leaving them?" The mother nodded, tears streaming down her face. "We told them. They don't understand. How could they?" Caleb looked at the children, then at Clara. She could read the question in his face. They were already at capacity. Resources were stretched. Taking 3 more would push everything to the breaking point. Clara thought about standing on that auction block, about being treated like livestock, about the difference between being abandoned by people who didn't care and being given up by people who cared too much. She nodded. Caleb turned back to the parents. Leave them. But I want your names and where you're headed. When circumstances improve, if you want them back, we'll talk. The father's shoulders sagged with relief and shame in equal measure. Thank you. We'll come back. I promise. Maybe you will, maybe you won't, Caleb said. Either way, they'll be taken care of. The goodbyes were brutal to watch. The mother held each child like she was trying to memorize the feel of them. The father kept his jaw clenched so tight Clara thought it might crack. The children cried, not understanding why their parents were leaving, only knowing that they were. After the wagon disappeared down the trail, the 3 children stood in the yard looking lost and terrified. Clara crouched down to their level. I'm Clara, she said gently. What are your names? The oldest girl, the 8-year-old, wiped her face and straightened her shoulders in a gesture Clara recognized all too well. I'm Sarah. This is my sister Beth and my brother James. It's nice to meet you, Sarah. You're going to stay with us for a while. It's going to be strange and probably scary, but I promise you're safe here. Clara stood and held out her hand. Come on, let me show you around. Sarah took her hand and Beth grabbed onto her other side. James clung to Sarah. Together they walked toward the house, 3 more children learning how to survive something that shouldn't happen but did anyway. And that night Clara found Caleb in the barn, which had become his refuge when things got heavy. He was repairing a bridle, his hands moving with the automatic precision of someone who'd done the same task 1,000 times. We can't keep doing this, Clara said. Caleb didn't look up. Doing what? Taking in every child that shows up. We're going to break. We've been going to break since the beginning. Haven't yet. That's not a plan, Caleb. That's luck. Clara leaned against a post. 3 more children means 3 more beds we don't have. 3 more mouths we can barely feed. At some point, we have to acknowledge limits. And then what? Turn away the next one? Tell them sorry. We're full. Good luck out there. Caleb's hand stilled on the bridle. I can't do that. You might have to. I won't. Clara felt frustration bubble up. Then what's your solution? Keep expanding until we collapse? Work ourselves into the ground trying to save everyone? If that's what it takes, that's not sustainable. You know it's not. Claire's voice rose despite her efforts to stay calm. We need a real plan, not just stubborn refusal to acknowledge reality. Caleb finally looked at her, and Clara saw exhaustion etched into every line of his face. He looked older than 45, worn down by years of fighting battles that never really ended. You're right, he said quietly. Clara blinked. What? You're right. We need a plan. A real one. Caleb set down the bridle. I've been thinking about this for a while, about how to make this bigger without making it break. And we need more refuges, not just this one. Others like it, spread out across the state. Places that can take in children when we're full. A network instead of one isolated operation. Clara stared at him. That's insane. Probably, but it's also necessary. Caleb stood and brushed dust from his pants. One refuge can only do so much. But 10, 20, that changes things. That becomes a movement instead of an experiment. How would we even start something like that? Same way we started this one step at a time. Caleb moved toward the barn door, then paused. I'm not asking you to do it. I'm telling you it needs to be done, whether by us or someone else. He left Clara standing in the barn, her mind racing. The idea was enormous, terrifying, and possibly brilliant, but Clara couldn't shake the feeling that Caleb was talking about something he wouldn't be around to see. The following weeks brought change in ways Clara didn't expect. Margaret, who'd been the backbone of the refuge's daily operations, announced she was leaving. My sister in Missouri is ill, Margaret explained. She has no one else. I need to go care for her. The news hit Clara like a physical blow. For how long? I don't know, Could be months, could be permanent. Margaret's expression was apologetic but firm. I'm sorry, I know the timing is terrible. The timing is always terrible, Clara said, trying to keep the bitterness out of her voice. But you have to go. Family's family. You'll manage without me. You've been running things for months anyway. With your help, with my presence, there's a difference. Margaret squeezed Clara's shoulder. You're ready for this. You've been ready. After Margaret left, the weight of full responsibility settled onto Clara's shoulders. She'd been helping run things for 2 years, but having final say on everything was different. Every decision, every problem, every crisis landed on her desk with nowhere else to go. Eleanor stepped up, taking over more of Margaret's duties while still managing the education program. Tommy, now 15 and nearly as capable as Caleb with repairs and animal care, became Clara's right hand for practical operations. But the burden was still crushing. One morning, Clara woke up and couldn't move. Not physically paralyzed, but mentally frozen. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the things that needed doing, and couldn't force herself to start any of them. May found her an hour later. You're scaring the children. I'm scaring myself, Clara admitted. May sat on the edge of the bed. What's wrong? Everything. Nothing. I don't know. Clara's voice cracked. How did Caleb do this? How did Margaret? It's too much. I can't be responsible for all of them. Then don't be. Clara looked at her sister. What? Stop trying to carry everything alone. Delegate. Trust other people to handle things. May's voice was gentle but firm. You're not Caleb, Clara. You don't have to be. You just have to be you. The words cut through the paralysis. Clara sat up slowly. I don't know how to be just me anymore. Then figure it out, because the children need you functional, not perfect. May left, and Clara sat there absorbing the truth of what her sister had said. She'd been trying so hard to fill Caleb's shoes, to be the leader everyone needed, that she'd forgotten how to just be herself. The girl who survived the auction block hadn't done it by being perfect. She'd done it by being stubborn and scared and determined not to let her sisters down. Maybe that was enough. Clara got up, washed her face, and went to work. But she did it differently. She asked Tommy to handle the morning chores without supervision. She let Ruth plan meals for the week. She trusted Eleanor to manage discipline issues with the younger children. And slowly, the crushing weight began to distribute itself across shoulders that were willing to help carry it. Summer brought visitors. Howard Finch returned for his quarterly inspection, but this time he brought 2 other men, one from the state legislature, another from a charitable foundation. Mr. Ward, Finch said, shaking Caleb's hand, these gentlemen wanted to see your operation firsthand. They're considering funding proposals for similar institutions. The legislator was a stern-looking man named Patterson, who asked pointed questions about costs, outcomes, and sustainability. The foundation representative, Mr. Whitmore, seemed more interested in the children themselves, watching how they interacted and worked together. Clara gave them the tour, explaining their structure and methods with the confidence she'd had to build piece by piece over 2 years. She showed them the dormitory, the bathhouse, the classroom, the gardens. She introduced them to children who'd arrived broken and were slowly becoming whole. How do you measure success? Patterson asked. Clara thought about that. We don't. Not in ways you can put in a report, anyway. We measure it in nightmares that stop happening, in children who learn to trust again, in futures that wouldn't have existed otherwise. That's not very quantifiable. No, but it's honest. Whitmore smiled slightly. I like her. After they left, Caleb pulled Clara aside. You did well. They're going to want numbers, proof that this works. Then we give them numbers. Caleb's expression was thoughtful. 15 children housed, all fed, clothed, educated. 0 returned to state institutions. 3 placed with families. 2 learning trades. That's proof. You think it'll be enough? It'll have to be. 3 weeks later, word came that the foundation was approving funding for 3 new refuges, 1 north, 1 south, 1 west. Caleb would oversee their establishment, providing guidance and structure based on what they'd built. The night they received the news, Clara found Caleb on the porch, staring out at the prairie. He looked tired, but satisfied. Like a man who'd accomplished something worth the cost. You did it, Clara said, sitting beside him. "We did it." "How do you feel?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Like I can finally stop." The words sent a chill through Clara. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm tired, Clara. Bone-deep tired. The kind that doesn't go away with sleep." He turned to look at her. "I've been pushing for 2 years to make this sustainable, to build something that would outlast me. And now it will. 3 more refuges. A network. The beginning of something real. You're not thinking of leaving. Not leaving, stepping back." Caleb's voice was gentle. "You don't need me anymore, not the way you did." "That's not true." "It is. You've been running this place for months, making decisions, solving problems, leading the others. All I've been doing is standing in the background in case you needed backup." He smiled slightly. "You never did." Clara felt panic rising in her chest. "I don't want to do this without you." "Yes, you do. You're just scared." Caleb put a hand on her shoulder. "Fear's natural, but it doesn't mean you're not ready." Clara wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that she still needed him. But the truth was, she'd been running the refuge on her own for months. Caleb had been there, but more as a presence than an active participant. She'd stopped asking his permission, stopped checking her decisions. She'd just done what needed doing. "What will you do?" Clara asked quietly. "Help establish the other refuges. Make sure they have what they need to start. Then, maybe," Caleb looked out at the prairie, "maybe rest, for the first time in 5 years. You've earned it. So have you, but your work's just beginning." They sat in silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Clara thought about the journey from that auction block to this moment, about the girl she'd been and the woman she'd become, about all the children who'd found their way here and the ones who would come after. "I'm scared," Clara admitted. "Good," Caleb said. "Means you understand the weight of what you're carrying. Just don't let it crush you." Caleb left 2 months later. Not dramatically, not with speeches or ceremony. He just packed his things one morning, said his goodbyes, and rode off to help establish the Northern Refuge. He promised to return for visits, to check in regularly, but everyone understood what was really happening. The Ward Refuge was Clara's now. Fully, completely, irrevocably. The first week without Caleb was terrifying. Clara kept waiting for something to go catastrophically wrong, for proof that she couldn't handle this alone. But nothing broke. The children still got fed, chores still got done, problems still got solved. Life continued. Tommy found Clara in the barn one evening, staring at Caleb's old workbench. "You all right?" he asked. "I don't know," Clara said honestly. "Ask me in a year." "You're doing fine." "I'm barely keeping my head above water." That's what it always feels like. Caleb felt that way too. Tommy leaned against the wall. "Difference is, you keep swimming anyway." Clara smiled despite herself. "When did you get wise?" "Been watching you and Caleb for 2 years, learned from the best." Tommy was 17 now, nearly grown. In a year or two, he'd likely move on, find his own path. The same was true for May and Ruth. Eventually, all the children grew up and left. That was the point. But it made Clara wonder about her own future. Eleanor had been right. Clara had options. She could leave, pursue education, explore the world beyond this ranch. The refuge would survive without her. Tommy was capable. Eleanor was committed. New leadership would emerge. But every time Clara thought about leaving, she remembered Sarah and Beth and James watching their parents' wagon disappear. She remembered Rose learning to speak again. She remembered Tommy the day they'd kept him from being dragged back to the workhouse. This wasn't a burden she was trapped under. It was a choice she kept making, and that made all the difference. A year after Caleb left, the refuge held 23 children. They'd expanded twice more, building another dormitory and establishing proper schoolrooms. Eleanor had brought on an assistant teacher. Tommy managed most of the practical operations. Ruth ran the kitchen with efficiency that would have made Margaret proud. Clara turned 19 in spring, and the children insisted on celebrating with a cake Ruth baked that collapsed in the middle, but tasted good enough that no one cared. They sang, they laughed, and for a moment Clara let herself feel young instead of perpetually responsible. That night she found a letter waiting in the small office she'd claimed as her own. It was from Caleb. Clara, the Northern Refuge is established and running well. 30 children housed, good staff, solid foundation. I'm heading to help with the Southern one next. This is working. The network's growing. People are starting to see this as something real, not just an experiment. I heard about your expansion. 23 children. I'm not surprised. I always knew you'd take this further than I could. I also heard from Patterson. The legislature is discussing a formal funding mechanism for refugees across the state. If it passes, this becomes permanent, institutionalized in the good way, not the bad way. You did that, Clara. You and everyone at Ward, you proved it could work. You changed minds and policies and lives. That's no small thing. I'll visit when I can, but I suspect you'll be too busy to notice if I don't. Keep fighting, keep building, keep showing them what's possible. Caleb. Clara read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the drawer where she kept important documents. Caleb was right. She was busy, but she'd make time if he visited. She owed him that much and more. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Sarah, now 10 years old and one of the more responsible children, poked her head in. "There's a family here," Sarah said. "They want to talk to you." Clara stood, smoothing her dress and following Sarah outside. In the yard stood a man and woman she didn't recognize, holding the hands of 2 small children. They looked desperate and hopeful in equal measure. "Are you Clara Brennan?" the woman asked. "I am. We heard about this place, that you take in children who need homes." The woman's voice trembled. "We can't keep them. We've tried, but we're starving. If we don't do something, they'll die." Clara looked at the children, a boy and a girl, maybe 6 and 4. They clung to their mother's skirts, scared but not yet broken. There was still light in their eyes, still hope. She thought about the auction block, about Caleb stepping forward when everyone else had given up on them, about Margaret and Eleanor and Tommy and all the others who'd helped build something that mattered. She thought about limits and sustainability and the very real danger of taking on more than they could handle. Then she looked at those 2 children again and made a choice. "Come inside," Clara said. "Let's talk." What? By the time Clara turned 21, the Ward Refuge had become a model. 4 more refuges had opened across Kansas, each one following the structure and principles Caleb and Clara had established. The legislature had passed funding legislation. Churches and charitable organizations donated resources. The workhouse system began to crumble as people demanded better options for displaced children. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. Children still suffered. Families still broke under the weight of poverty and hardship. But now there were places they could go, networks of support. People who understood that orphans weren't problems to be managed, but children deserving of care and opportunity. Clara stood in the yard one summer evening, watching the children play before supper. May was teaching the younger ones a game. Ruth was in the kitchen with 2 of the older girls preparing the meal. Tommy was working in the barn with 3 boys learning basic carpentry. Eleanor approached, carrying papers. "The foundation wants a report on our educational outcomes. They're considering expanding support to include secondary education for the older children." Clara took the papers. "Secondary education. That's ambitious." "So is everything we do." Eleanor smiled. "You should consider it yourself. There's a women's college in Massachusetts that's accepting applications. I took the liberty of requesting information." Clara looked at her. "You think I should leave? I think you should have the option, same as we want for all the children." Eleanor's expression was serious. "You've built something incredible here, Clara, but it can run without you. The question is whether you want it to." Clara didn't answer immediately. She looked around the refuge, at the buildings they'd raised, the gardens they'd planted, the children they'd saved. She thought about Caleb's words. "This isn't about me. It never was." Maybe it was time to find out who Clara Brennan was beyond the refuge. Maybe it was time to choose her own path instead of following the one circumstances had carved out. Or maybe her path was here, leading, teaching, building. making sure no child ever stood on an auction block again. "I'll think about it," Clara said finally. "That's all I ask." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the refuge, May breathing beside her, the wind rattling the windows, distant voices as older children settled in for the night. Home sounds. Safe sounds. She thought about the girl she'd been 3 years ago, standing on that platform terrified and desperate. That girl had wanted one thing, to keep her sisters safe. She'd achieved that. May was thriving, Ruth was confident and capable, Lila was happy and healthy. But somewhere along the way, Clara's purpose had expanded beyond just protecting her sisters. It had grown to encompass all the children who came through these doors, all the ones who would come in the future. The movement Caleb had started and Clara had nurtured into something permanent. She thought about leaving, about pursuing education and opportunities beyond this ranch. The idea was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. But she also thought about Sarah asking for help with her reading, about Tommy working beside her to repair a fence, about the new children arriving scared and finding safety. The truth was, Clara didn't have to choose. Not right now. Not forever. She could stay until someone else was ready to lead, until the refuge was stable enough to survive her absence, until her debt to Caleb and all the children who'd become her family was paid. Or maybe she'd never leave. Maybe this was her calling, her purpose, the thing she was meant to do. Not because she had no other options, but because she chose it freely, understanding the weight and accepting it anyway. Either way, the choice was hers, and that was everything. Sant. 5 years after the auction block, Clara stood in front of the state legislature. She was 22, wearing her best dress, and carrying documents that represented years of work and hundreds of lives changed. She'd been invited to testify about the refuge system, to provide evidence of its effectiveness, and argue for expanded funding. The room was full of men who looked skeptical at best, hostile at worst. But Clara had faced worse than skeptical men. "My name is Clara Brennan," she began, her voice steady. "5 years ago, I stood on an auction block in Kansas, being sold with my 3 sisters because our uncle saw us as livestock instead of human beings. We were children, orphaned, terrified, and completely powerless." She saw some of the legislators shift uncomfortably. "A man named Caleb Ward bought us. He paid $50 to keep us together. He brought us to his ranch and gave us something no one else would. A chance. Not charity. Not pity. A chance to work, to learn, to become capable." Clara pulled out her first document. In 5 years, the Ward Refuge has housed 63 children. Of those, 47 have either returned to family when circumstances improved, been placed with good homes, or aged out having learned trades or pursued education. 16 remain in residence, all fed, clothed, educated, and safe. She pulled out another document. The 4 refuges established across Kansas have similar outcomes. Over 200 children removed from workhouses, auction blocks, or abusive situations, given structure, care, and opportunity. "Miss Brennan," one legislator interrupted, "this is all very touching, but what you're describing is expensive. The state has limited resources. Why should we fund these refuges when the workhouse system already exists?" Clara looked him in the eye. "Because the workhouse system kills children. Slowly, through overwork and neglect and cruelty disguised as discipline. Your system takes orphans and grinds them down until they break. Ours takes them and builds them up until they can stand on their own." That's quite an accusation. It's the truth, and you know it. Clara didn't back down. "You want numbers? Fine. Workhouse mortality rate for children under 12 is nearly 40%. Refuge system mortality rate is less than 5%. Workhouse children who survive leave with no skills, no education, and trauma that follows them their entire lives. Refuge children leave with trades, education, and the ability to contribute to society." She spread her papers across the table. "You want to save money? Invest in refuges. Healthy, educated citizens who pay taxes and contribute to the economy instead of dying young or ending up criminals because they had no other options. This isn't charity, it's good policy." The room was silent. Then one of the older legislators, a man named Morrison, who'd been listening quietly, spoke. "Miss Brennan, You were sold at auction at 15. Now you're testifying before the state legislature at 22. You manage a refuge housing 24 children. You're articulate, confident, and capable. He leaned forward. That's quite a transformation. It's what happens when someone gives you a chance instead of giving up on you. Morrison smiled slightly. Point taken. He looked at his colleagues. I move that we approve the funding expansion. These refugees have proven their worth. It's time we acknowledge that and provide proper support. The motion carried by a narrow margin, but it carried. As Clara left the building, papers clutched in her hands, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Not relief, not satisfaction, something deeper. Like she'd finally paid back the debt she'd owed since the day Caleb stepped forward at that auction. Clara returned to the refuge to find it in chaos. Not bad chaos, but the kind that came from life happening all at once. 2 new children had arrived. Tommy had proposed to one of the neighboring farmer's daughters and was planning to move out. May had been accepted to a teaching program in town. Ruth was negotiating with a local restaurant owner about purchasing their preserved goods. Eleanor met Clara at the door. Welcome back. How'd it go? They approved the funding. Eleanor's face lit up. Clara, that's incredible. It's a start. Clara set down her bag. What did I miss? Everything and nothing, the usual. Eleanor handed her a stack of messages. Caleb sent word he's coming to visit next month, wants to see how things are going. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. Good, it'll be good to see him. That night, after the children were in bed and the refuge had settled into quiet, Clara walked outside. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, dark and vast under a sky heavy with stars. She thought about the journey, from auction block to this moment, from powerless child to woman who'd testified before the state legislature and won. She thought about Caleb, who'd given her a chance when no one else would. About Margaret, who'd taught her how to lead. About Eleanor, who'd shown her she had options. About all the children who'd passed through these doors and the ones who would come after. The refuge wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real, and it worked, and it mattered. That was enough. May found her there. You're thinking too loud. Clara smiled. Sorry. Are you okay? Really? Clara thought about it. She was tired. Always tired. The weight of responsibility never fully lifted. But she was also fulfilled in a way she hadn't known was possible. She'd taken her own trauma and turned it into something that helped others. She'd proven that the world's cruelty didn't have to be the final word. Yeah, Clara said. I'm okay. May leaned against her shoulder. I'm leaving in the fall for the teaching program. I know. Are you mad? Why would I be mad? Because I'm leaving you with everything. Clara wrapped an arm around her sister. I'm not mad. I'm proud. That's the whole point. You get to choose what comes next. All of you do. What about you? What do you choose? Clara looked at the refuge, lights glowing warm in the windows. This, for now, maybe forever. I don't know yet. That's okay, not knowing. Is it? May squeezed her hand. You taught me that. When you said we didn't have to have all the answers, we just had to keep moving forward. Clara couldn't remember saying that, but it sounded like something she would have said. Something she'd learned from Caleb, who'd learned it from surviving his own losses. We did all right, Clara said quietly. Didn't we? Better than all right. May's voice was warm. We survived, and then we thrived, and then we helped others do the same. That's more than most people accomplish in a lifetime. Clara let that settle over her. She was 22. She'd accomplished more than she'd ever imagined possible. But she also knew the work wasn't finished. It never would be. There would always be more children who needed help, more battles to fight, more systems to change. But tonight, standing under the stars with her sister beside her, Clara let herself feel something she'd been too scared to feel for years. Peace. Not the absence of struggle, not the end of hardship, but the deep, bone-level certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The girl who'd stood on that auction block had been powerless, The woman who stood here now had built power from nothing. Not power over others, but the power to change circumstances, to offer hope, to turn cruelty into compassion. That was worth every sleepless night, every impossible decision, every moment of doubt. When Caleb visited the following month, he looked older but healthier, less worn down by grief. He walked the grounds with Clara, inspecting the improvements and meeting the new children. "You've done well," he said finally. "We've done well," Clara corrected. "You started this. I gave it a push. You built it into something real." Caleb stopped and looked at her. "I'm proud of you. Don't think I've said that enough." Clara's throat tightened. "Thank you for everything, for not giving up on us." "You made it easy." Caleb smiled, and it was the first real smile Clara had seen from him in years. "You know what the best part is? Watching you become someone I couldn't have imagined when you were 15, someone stronger and braver than I ever was." "That's not true." "It is. I bought you because I couldn't live with myself if I didn't. You built this because you couldn't live in a world where children suffer when you can do something about it. There's a difference. Your reason is better than mine." They walked in silence for a while. Then Caleb spoke again. "I'm not coming back after this visit, not to stay." Clara had known it was coming, but it still hurt. "Where will you go?" "West, maybe California, somewhere I can stop fighting for a while." Caleb's voice was quiet. "I've been running on fumes for 5 years, Clara. Running from grief, running toward purpose. I need to stop. Just exist for a bit without constantly pushing against the world." "You've earned it. So have you. Don't forget that." Caleb turned to face her fully. "This place doesn't own you. You choose to be here. That choice is what makes it matter." Clara nodded, understanding finally clicking into place. The difference between obligation and choice, between being trapped and being committed. "Will you write?" Clara asked. "When I can." Caleb squeezed her shoulder. "But you don't need letters from me. You haven't needed me for a long time." "I'll always need you, just differently than before." Caleb's eyes were bright. "That's the best thing you could have said." 3 days later, Clara stood in the yard watching Caleb ride away for what might be the last time. She didn't cry. She'd done enough crying over the years. Instead, she turned back to the refuge where children were laughing and working and learning how to build lives from wreckage. Tommy approached, hammer in hand. "What do you need?" "The eastern fence needs mending, and the roof on the dormitory is leaking again." "I'll handle it." Tommy paused. "You all right?" "I will be." He nodded and walked away, and Clara realized something profound. She'd spent years trying to live up to Caleb's example, trying to be the leader he'd been. But she'd become her own kind of leader, one who asked for help, who trusted others, who understood that strength came from community rather than carrying everything alone. That night, she gathered all the children in the main room. They ranged from 6 to 17, a mix of ages and stories and wounds in various stages of healing. "I want to tell you something," Clara began. 5 years ago, I stood on an auction block. I was terrified. I thought my life was over. I thought I'd never be anything more than someone's property. The room was silent, every eye on her. But someone decided I was worth more than $10. Someone decided my sisters and I deserved a chance. And that one decision changed everything. Clara looked at each of them. Every single one of you is here because someone made a choice. To help. To care. To believe you're worth the effort. She saw Sarah sitting with her younger siblings, the 3 of them together because their parents had made the hardest choice of their lives. She saw Rose, who'd learned to speak again. She saw Tommy, who'd become a partner instead of a scared child. "We can't control what happened to us before we came here," Claire continued, "but we can control what happens next. We can choose to let trauma define us, or we can choose to build something better. We can carry our wounds, or we can learn from them. We can stay victims, or we can become survivors." She smiled, feeling the weight of everything she'd learned settle into something solid and sure. This place exists because a man decided orphans deserved better. It thrives because all of us, every single person here, decided to work together to make it real. That's what family is. Not blood, not obligation, but choice. Choosing every day to show up for each other, to keep building, to keep fighting. Clara straightened her shoulders. So that's what we're going to keep doing, together. Because we're not just survivors anymore. We're builders. We're changers. We're proof that the world's cruelty doesn't get the last word. The room erupted in applause and cheers. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears. The kind that came from reaching the other side of something impossible and realizing you'd made it after all. Later, when everyone had gone to bed, Clara sat at her desk and pulled out paper. She began to write, documenting everything they'd learned, everything they'd built. Not for herself, but for whoever came after. For the refuges being established across the state. For the people who would read about what they'd accomplished and dare to try something similar. She wrote about structure and compassion, about discipline tempered with understanding. She wrote about the importance of giving children agency, of teaching them they had choices. She wrote about failure and recovery, about learning from mistakes instead of being destroyed by them. She wrote until her hand cramped and the lamp burned low. And when she finally stopped, Clara realized she'd written more than a manual. She'd written a testament, proof that 4 girls sold on an auction block had survived, thrived, and changed the world around them. That was legacy. Not perfection, but transformation. Not absence of pain, but refusal to let pain be the ending. Clara set down her pen and looked out the window at the refuge she'd helped build. In the distance, dawn was breaking, painting the prairie in shades of gold and rose. A new day. A new beginning. She'd been powerless once, terrified, certain the world would grind her down until nothing remained. But she'd been wrong. She hadn't just survived, she'd rebuilt herself and helped others do the same. She'd taken the worst moment of her life and transformed it into something that mattered, into proof that compassion could override cruelty, that community could heal what isolation destroyed, that one person's choice to care could ripple outward and change hundreds of lives. The girl on the auction block was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her own strength, who understood that power wasn't about control, but about lifting others up, who'd learned that the only way to truly heal was to help others heal alongside you. Clara stood and walked outside into the breaking dawn. The refuge was quiet, peaceful, safe, real. She'd done what Caleb asked. She'd kept it about the children. She'd built something that would outlast her. And in doing so, she'd found herself, not the broken girl from the auction block, not the overwhelmed teenager trying to hold everything together, but Clara Brennan, survivor, leader, builder, someone who'd looked at the world's cruelty and said no, who'd chosen compassion when indifference would have been easier, who'd proven that one person's decision to care could change everything. The sun crested the horizon, flooding the prairie with light. Clara smiled and walked back inside, ready for whatever came next. Because she'd learned the most important lesson of all. You couldn't control what the world did to you, but you could control what you did with it. You could let it break you, or you could use the broken pieces to build something new, something better. Something that proved the world's darkness didn't have to win. That was the legacy of the Ward Refuge. Not perfection, but possibility. Not the absence of suffering, but the transformation of it into purpose. And Clara would carry that forward, one day at a time, one child at a time, for as long as she had breath in her body. Because some debts couldn't be repaid. They could only be passed forward.